Imagine watching your best friend, fighting to hold on to life, not in a blaze of battlefield glory, not beneath the blaring sirens or the frantic flicker of midnight city lights. No, this battle unfolded inside a sterile white room, paralyzed in silence. The only sounds were the dull, rhythmic pulse of machines and the ragged, broken breaths of a being who once was life itself, who once was light, who once was the reason someone didn't give up. Fight lay motionless on the cold metal table in the emergency ward of New Haven Animal Center. The massive body that had once been a wall between Ryan and every kind of pain was now curled inward, drained of strength, no longer reacting, no longer releasing that low, familiar growl whenever he sensed unease. His gray and brown coat, once gleaming in the golden light as they ran side by side through the valley, had dulled with time, patchy around the abdomen where IV tubes and monitors clung like lifelines. His ears, once sharply alert to the slightest sound, now drooped, thin as paper, as if holding on to one last pocket of peace for his human. Ryan sat pressed against the side of the table, head bowed, his hand gripping Fight's worn, scarred paw. That paw had once shoved open the locked door to pull him out of a room he thought would end him. That paw had struck the floor every time he collapsed in despair. That paw had once rested on his chest, wordlessly telling him, "I'm here." And now Ryan clung to it like the last anchor in a storm that was ripping apart every memory, every layer of armor he'd built just to survive. There was no sharp scent of medicine in the air, no nurses rushing about, no alarms, just the stifling stillness of something nobody dared to name. Dr. Evans, a man whose face had weathered too many goodbyes and whose ashen eyes looked dry from seeing too much, stood a few paces back. He had spoken only once. "He's fading." And then came the kind of silence that felt like time had drained out of the room, leaving only a heavy void and the fragile breath of a soul unwilling to vanish. Ryan wasn't someone who cried easily, not since the accident, the one that took his only brother, the one who had taught him how to catch a ball, how to hold on, how to believe in something better. Since then, tears had stopped coming. They had no place in a life rebuilt from ash. But now he felt himself cracking, down to the deepest part of him, where things long buried began to seep out, layer after aching layer. Fight had been there for the darkest days, when everyone else left, when phones stopped ringing, when mailboxes sat empty and the call logs became a museum of unanswered tries. Through it all, Fight remained. No demands, no questions, no exits, just there. Quiet as a piece of a world Ryan no longer believed he belonged to. And now, he was being asked to face the one thing he had never prepared for, a life without Fight. A world where mornings would no longer come with the soft tap of Paws at the door, where the first sip of coffee wouldn't be shared with a silent shape under the table, where things might feel empty again, all over. A longer beep pierced the stillness. Ryan looked up. No one entered. No one spoke. The monitor blinked, a single number lower. The world outside faded, and he felt the planet itself holding its breath, waiting to see if the soul in front of him would let go. He laid his forehead against Fight's chest. He no longer cared about posture, about how it looked. He just needed to be closer. Just a little more. "Your name is Fight, remember?" he whispered, voice rasped from a sleepless night. "I named you that not because you were fierce, but because I needed someone to remind me that staying alive is a kind of fight too." A soft breeze nudged the glass window. An oak branch tapped gently against the pane. Ryan closed his eyes. Images of Fight flooded his mind like an old reel of film. Fields, rivers, a chase after a ball, That moment he stood between Ryan and a drunken man yelling in the street. Still vivid, still real, still here. So much that it hurt. He didn't know if Fight could still hear him, didn't know if beneath that faded fur the heart still wanted to beat. But he knew one thing. He was still here, and he would stay until time itself stopped, or until Fight stood up on his own. "No one's forcing you to stay, Fight," he whispered, eyes still shut. "But if there's even a sliver of you that wants to hold on, let me be what you hold." A faint exhale drifted into the air. Not loud, not clear, not certain. But Ryan felt it, a thread of warmth across his fingertips, resting on the weak rise of Fight's chest. No rhythm, no proof. But not nothing either. Ryan didn't speak again. He just stayed there, both hands wrapped around that paw, eyes open, heart wide open. And in that moment, every defense he'd ever built, every shield of silence, every sarcastic wall, every cynical smirk, fell away. Not in search of an answer, but to preserve one last thing: life, friendship, and the smallest kind of miracle this side of ordinary. In the cold breath of metal beneath Fight, and the colorless glow of fluorescent light over scratched tile, Ryan let his fingers brush gently through the short, brittle fur aged by time. Near the base of the left foreleg, where hair no longer grew, lay an old scar, the very first wound carried by a scrawny pup the day Ryan met him at that rundown shelter beside Highway 7. It had been drizzling that day, not enough to flood, but just steady enough to blur all thoughts in the head of a man sitting in a stalled car for over 3 hours. Ryan hadn't planned to stop at that shelter, with its damp air, tired barking, and wooden signs scribbled with names no one had any hope left to remember. But that smell, that thick, earthy dampness, drew him in. Not out of love, but because his head felt too heavy, his hands too numb, and his eyes too raw from trying to hold back a breakdown that had nowhere else to go. The night shift attendant that evening, a gaunt young man with a hoarse voice, merely nodded in silence when Ryan said, "I'm not here to adopt." He didn't ask why. He didn't show any of the animals. He simply unlocked the last cage at the end of the row and stepped outside without a word. In that fleeting moment, Ryan braced himself to meet a pair of pleading eyes, or perhaps a trembling body clinging to the last scraps of hope. The kind of image every story about abandoned pets seems to echo with weary inevitability. But that did not come. The creature in the corner of the cage didn't stir, didn't howl, didn't bark, didn't open its eyes, yet it didn't shrink away either. It lay on its side, front legs folded inward, back legs tucked tight against its body, the lower belly still stained with blood gone dark and dry. No questions were needed. Ryan knew just by looking that the animal had fought back, not to escape, but to refuse being taken with disgrace. It had not surrendered, not even when there was nothing left to defend. Ryan stood there for a long time. He didn't step closer. He didn't retreat. He simply watched that shape, a muddied brown-gray heap, still as stone. And in a strange, heavy instant, he felt as though he were staring into a harsher, rougher version of himself, stripped of the dignity that came with being called human. It took nearly 10 minutes before the creature moved. No turning of the head, just the slow curling of a leg, as if to hide an old scar, not from shame, but from having grown used to concealing what made one vulnerable. That day, Ryan signed the adoption papers, not through protocol, not with background checks, not with promises, only with a quiet sentence. "I'll take him now." He didn't choose a name right away. He didn't bring expectations. There was no pretty leash, no collar with a nameplate, no bag of brightly colored kibble. Just two silent bodies in an old car that reeked of gasoline, heading west. Not because the West held something waiting, but because the east was where he once wished to disappear. It wasn't until the 5th day, when the air had turned cold and their breath fogged up the window glass, that Ryan spoke the name for the first time. The dog still hadn't let him touch it. It ate only when Ryan left the seat. It slept curled by the door, but kept its eyes open each time Ryan moved. There was no hatred in its gaze, nor affection. Only life. Only existence. He named it Fight, not because it had been forced into battle, but because Ryan needed a name to remind himself that some beings do not choose to fight, and yet still do, because it's the only way not to be swept under. That name was first written in marker on the side of an antibiotic box, then carved into a makeshift collar fashioned from climbing rope, then scribbled on a piece of paper stuck to the refrigerator door in a rented room. No one enters if Fight doesn't agree. And day by day, that name became the only thing the two of them needed between them. When Ryan collapsed at his desk, and Fight rested its head on his leg. When Ryan woke up drenched in sweat in the middle of the night, and Fight gave a soft bark, just loud enough to wake him, never to startle. When they looked at each other after a sudden seizure, and neither walked away first. That name was never a call, nor a tender nickname. It was an unspoken pact. We fight together, until there's nothing left to hold on to, or until one of us is strong enough to pull the other back up. Ryan still remembers the first time Fight let him touch the old scar. It was a wind-heavy morning, the kind that carried the scent of hospitals and the rustle of paper. He had just returned home from the psychiatric ward, a 3-month leave of absence clutched in his hand. He lay down on the floor, didn't cry, didn't speak, just stared at the ceiling. And Fight came over, slowly, no licking, no nudging. It simply lay beside him, then turned over, revealing its belly where the wound had once been, and sighed, as if in acceptance. From that day forward, Ryan no longer hid the scars inside himself. He began walking every morning, ate his meals on time, started writing again, little things, like how Fight barked at 6:45 every morning, exactly when the alarm rang, or how he draped his paw over the chair like it was a throne. One detail each day, one movement, one sign that Fight was never just a dog, but the echo of every part of Ryan he had once believed had died. And now, as the name appears again, on the medical chart, on the blood transfusion file, on the monitor tracking a fragile heartbeat, Ryan knows. If this name once pulled him from the edge, then this time, it will be him who keeps it alive. Fight, he whispers, eyes resting on the barely parted lids of the still body before him. I don't need you to win. I just need you to fight a little longer. Because that name was never a command. It was a promise, a beginning. Once more. The emergency room door eased open. No sharp sound, just the quiet presence of someone too familiar with these halls to need assertion or noise to affirm his authority. Dr. Evans entered, a man whose temples had begun to gray, whose shoulders remained upright, but had long since shed the arrogance of youth, whose eyes carried the silence of one who had witnessed the fiercest battles ever fought, not against death, but against the will to let go. He didn't look at Ryan right away. He stood still for a moment, gaze fixed on the heartbeat monitor, lights blinking in steady but faint rhythm, like the distant echo of a fire about to burn out, holding on just a bit longer for someone watching the final sparks. We've done everything within our reach, Evans said, voice neither cold nor trembling. It bore the weight of time, free from contempt, devoid of hope. Just the truth, spoken by a man who had long abandoned the habit of sugarcoating cruelty. Ryan didn't turn around. He remained seated, both hands cradling Fight's paw, his palms sticky with the dry traces of blood left from the IV piercing an artery that no longer responded. He said nothing, didn't react. Only tightened his grip slightly, just enough to be understood, just enough to make Dr. Evans realize that what he was about to say would not be received easily. Evans inhaled slowly, stepped forward, and gently pulled out a chipped metal chair, its paint flaking like time-worn resolve. He sat down, not as a professional maintaining distance, not as the man with the authority to decide what's best, but simply as someone who no longer wanted to stand apart. "He's in pain," he said softly, his eyes fixed on the dog. "We can't be certain if the internal damage is reversible, and if he wakes, he might not be the same anymore." Ryan said nothing. Only the harsh, gravelly breath from Fight's chest filled the space between the two men, an eerie, broken sound like a cracked flute, rising in the silence, suspended between them like a trembling line of fate. "Ryan," Evans called his name, gently, for the first time without clinical detachment. This was no longer the voice of medicine. It was the voice of a father, of someone who had once lost someone too. Sometimes, love means knowing when to let go. At that, Ryan lifted his head. His gaze met Evans's, a look not of rage, not of pleading, but the haunted stillness of a man pouring every breath into holding on to something already slipping through his hands. "Sometimes," Ryan said, voice hoarse like metal scraping old wood, "holding on is the only way to not lose yourself, and there are names that don't allow for surrender." Evans nodded, slow and heavy, like someone who'd once heard those very words in another version of his own life. Then he placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. Not to persuade, not to pressure. Just to touch. A small gesture that slowed time, like a camera shifting into slow motion, catching every unspoken movement shared between three lives. One man, another man, and a dog still fighting in silence. "We can stop the meds if you want," Evans murmured. "Let him go more gently, without pain." "No," Ryan said, for the first time with clarity. "Not today. Not while I'm still here. Not while his name is Fight." The words didn't fall. They landed, like a verdict, like a vow, like a pact both men understood without need for translation. This wasn't biology battling illness anymore. This was the last stand of a human heart against the tide, a final way of saying, "I will not let anyone go alone." Evans didn't speak again. He rose and stepped quietly toward the door, but just before leaving he turned back, his eyes stripped of judgment, free of suggestion. They simply held one message: "If you're right, I'll wait." The door clicked shut. Ryan lowered his head again, his fingers gently moving to the base of Fight's throat, where the heartbeat, uncertain, uneven, still pulsed faintly beneath thinning fur. A twitch ran through Fight's hind leg. A shiver. Small, insubstantial, not enough for science to call it hope, but enough for someone who still believed to not let go. "They want me to release you, Fight," Ryan whispered, his lips brushing the dog's fur like a reverse vow. "But I've let go of too much. I lost my brother. I lost my parents. I lost myself. And then I met you. I don't have room for one more goodbye." Light from the small window sliced across the wall, catching Fight's cheek, the part with a patch of uneven silver fur. Ryan stared at it, thinking for a second it looked like a beam of light trying to hold something in place, refusing to let it slip into darkness. No audience, no applause, no miracle bells ringing. Just a man sitting beside a dog whose breaths came fractured, and a whisper reaching through the dust of every shattered belief. "I'm here, and I'll stay here until you decide to go. Or until you open your eyes." Ryan had never been one for the idea of fate. He certainly never believed in life-changing coincidences. But that belief cracked one rainy afternoon when he stumbled into South Hollow Rescue Shelter, lost not on the map, but in the hollow of his own life. He hadn't come to be found. only to stop, somewhere quiet enough to fall apart. The wind had blown against a rusted gate, carrying the mingled scent of manure and mildew from the old tarps flapping across the kennels. Somewhere in the distance, there had been barking, ragged, directionless. Not a call, not even a plea, just the dull sound of creatures too tired to even ask for help anymore. Ryan had walked slowly down the cracked tile corridor, not reading the names on the doors, not deciphering the sounds. His legs simply moved, drawn by something deeper than logic, as if a part of him already knew where he was headed, even as his mind refused to admit it. A young volunteer had spotted him, a boy with acne and a t-shirt 2 sizes too large, raising a hand to greet, then lowering it. He said nothing, just looked at Ryan with a kind of strange understanding. Not the kind that comes with age, but the kind you earn by witnessing someone walk in the exact way you've seen others walk before. Shoulders sunken, soul burning low. No questions. No welcome speech. Just a gesture. A finger pointing to the end of the hallway, where a cracked wooden door sat half-blocked by a dented mop bucket and a small hand-written sign. Careful. Kennel number 9. Kennel 9 wasn't listed on the adoptable board. There were no photos, no profiles online. No one took visitors there. No one talked about it. And yet Ryan didn't ask. He simply bent down, moved the bucket aside, and pushed the door open. Not rushed, not afraid. Behind it was shadow. No light, no fan. A floor of rough concrete, scattered with puddles that hadn't dried. The smell of old blood mixed with the acrid bite of disinfectant. In the far corner, where water stains ran down the crumbling wall, was a body. Not large, not strong-looking. It didn't lie down. It didn't stand. It crouched, all 4 legs pulled in, neck tucked deep into itself, eyes wide but not seeing forward. That wasn't rest. That was survival. Ryan didn't move, didn't speak. He knew any sudden motion might trigger the creature into lunging, not to attack, but to protect whatever was left. And he didn't want that. He just wanted to watch, slowly, intently, the way this dog held himself in the posture of battle, even with blood still oozing from his hind leg, even with ears drooping in exhaustion, even with vision clouded. But something fierce, still burning beneath it all. No one told the story of what had happened to it. But Ryan didn't need anyone to tell it. He could see it, in the way it kept its distance, in how it balanced every ounce of weight on its front legs, in the way its eyes narrowed whenever he shifted even slightly. And that alone was enough to understand that this creature had once been torn away from something, had once been dragged off in fear, had once resisted so violently that it got hurt, and yet had not fallen. Ryan sat down. The chill of the concrete floor pierced through his thin jeans. But he didn't move. He simply sat, his back resting against the opposite wall, eyes fixed on the creature bracing itself like a lone warrior, unsure whether the next breath would bring a friend or someone who might shackle it all over again. And between them, there was no sound, save for the ceiling fan turning above in slow, ghost-like circles. Time passed without a ruler. It might have been 10 minutes. It might have been an hour. No one interrupted. No one asked. And by the time the sun began to dip behind the oaks outside the window, Ryan leaned forward, pulled his backpack toward him, opened the zipper, and retrieved a piece of dry bread, something he always carried for the days when anxiety clenched his stomach like a fist. He didn't reach out with it. He simply placed it down and rolled it gently towards the middle of the floor. Not too near, not too far. Then he leaned back, avoided direct eye contact, cast only a sidelong glance, and saw the smallest movement in the creature's front shoulder. A deeper breath, a faint gather of force in the legs. Then, with a motion that seemed torn from the fabric of an old pain, it crawled forward, not hurriedly, but with determination. Not out of hunger, not out of trust, but because it needed to prove to itself that it still could. When it took the bread in its jaws and retreated to its corner, Ryan didn't smile. He didn't say, "Thank you." He just watched, for a long time. And from that silence, a sound emerged, faint but clear in its certainty. "Fight." The dog didn't react. But this time its eyes settled on Ryan, not in suspicion, not as if gauging threat, but as though it had heard something familiar echoing from a place far back in memory, a place where names were the first things lost, and now the first things returned. "Fight," Ryan repeated, quieter now. "You don't have to trust me, just trust yourself." It was their first sunset together in silence. No one reached out, no one touched. But from that moment, Ryan knew. This being didn't need an owner. It needed a teammate. Someone who could sit beside it without commanding, without calling, without pulling, just being there, long enough to prove that he hadn't come to control. He had come to survive. Together. And for that reason, it was called Fight. Now, as the lights of the emergency room flicker through the frosted glass like shallow breaths, echoing the last fragile rhythms of life, Ryan still sits beside the motionless body, his spine curved forward, shoulders lowered as if trying to bridge the unreachable space between his own heart and the exhausted one beneath the pale gray fur. From the narrow window above, the night air slips in through the thin slats of the aluminum frame, brushing against the heavy white curtain, stirring it into a faint, wavering ripple, as if someone were gently urging something not quite ready to leave. The monitor light continues its steady pulse, dimming gradually, hesitating, as though even the numbers themselves weren't certain whether to persist or surrender to the code written deep in logic's bones. Ryan doesn't look at the screen. His gaze is fixed on a single point on the body before him, where Fight's shoulder meets the foreleg, the place that had once been caked in mud, had once been wrapped in bandages, had once pressed against his chest through countless sleepless nights. A patch of uneven, light-colored fur, the very spot where Ryan used to rest his palm to check for breath during nightmares, now held his stare, as if his hope had found form in a place that bore no shape, no sound, no name. His hand still cradles that rough, calloused paw, not too tight, not too loose, holding it with the exact pressure, the right rhythm, the shared warmth that seems to say, if we hold still enough, if we balance everything just so, maybe what's fading will pause, delay, change its mind. No one speaks in the room. Dr. Evans has stepped outside, leaving behind a silence that feels like a wall separating feeling from fact. The nurses walk past without lingering, glancing through the glass slit, not intruding. And Ryan stays there, not pleading, not bargaining, not praying, breathing slowly, as if sinking his entire being to the trembling thread of life still pulsing under his hand. And then, it happens. Not a jolt, not a movement you could swear upon, just the faintest shift, like a ripple across a frozen lake, a tremor at the ankle Ryan is holding, something so subtle it feels like the reflex of someone sleeping in cold wind, pulling their leg inward, not from instinct, but from memory. Ryan stops breathing. He doesn't pull his hand away, doesn't grip tighter. He simply pauses everything, every emotion, every racing thought, every imagined scenario of the final goodbye, and places his whole consciousness into that single flicker to test whether it was real, whether it meant life or the echo of a mind playing tricks at the edge of letting go. And then, a few seconds later, again, lighter this time, smaller. The muscle in Fight's leg shifts once more. Not rhythmic, not regular, but real enough for someone like Ryan, who had spent nights deciphering the smallest sounds to know whether Fight was dreaming or in pain, to feel it in full clarity. This was no involuntary spasm. This was a signal, a whisper from the deepest trench of endurance. I'm still here. He says nothing. Doesn't rise, doesn't call the doctor. He simply brings his other hand to rest gently on Fight's chest, where the ribs rise and fall in faint, hesitant pulses, like a dying ember breathing in the warmth of a fire builder's palm. The heart doesn't beat stronger. The lungs don't fill deeper. But they do not stop. Everything is still there, thin as breath on glass, fragile as ash before the wind. But still there. Ryan closed his eyes. He didn't need sight to believe. He had learned to feel Fight through breath, through the quiet heat that radiated off his body, through the kind of listening that required no sound. Just like the way they had crossed 6 snow-covered miles that winter night, guided only by flickers of eye contact and fragmented breaths between steps. And now he felt it again. Not a full movement, not a grand return, just the subtlest of signals, one that no one but Ryan could detect. The kind of half-presence that didn't mean waking, but didn't mean departure either. Fight lingered, right on the edge, suspended in the in-between, just to whisper without voice. I'm still fighting, even with what little I have left. In a night without alarms, without monitor spikes, without a single witness to call it recovery, Ryan bowed his head and pressed his forehead against the back of Fight's paw, not to beg for more time, but to offer a piece of his own fragile breath, to lend it to a soul that hadn't yet chosen to leave. You heard me, didn't you? He whispered, his lips barely moving, more air than sound. You don't have to growl. You don't have to stand. Just give me one more flicker, one more sign, so I know you haven't chosen to end this. There was no reply, no bark, no gesture, only a subtle ripple across the shoulder, this time just a little quicker than before, as if answering in the only way 2 creatures who never relied on words had always spoken, through the fierce, steady presence of being. And in that moment, Ryan understood. Fight had not let go. Time didn't rewind in minutes. It returned in memories. Not in dates or events, but in pain. Like that night, 2 a.m., when Ryan woke soaked in sweat, his eyes wide in a darkness no lamp could soften, heart pounding like someone was slamming their fists inside his chest. He didn't scream, didn't move, just sat there, frozen, caught between past and now, unsure if he was still alive or had been thrown back into that mangled frame, that crash, that moment of shattered glass and leaking gasoline, and the image of his brother's hand falling from the steering wheel like it was trying to hand him something unnamed. That night, Fight had lain just outside the door. He didn't bark. He didn't rush in. He simply opened his eyes, stood, and walked forward, 1 step, 2, 3, and stopped within arm's reach. Then he sat, silent as shadow, still as night. Ryan hadn't noticed, not until the tremors rolled from shoulder to knee, not until he was close to collapse from holding in everything he couldn't scream. And then, Fight moved. Just enough. Rested his chin on the bed's edge, not meeting Ryan's eyes, just angling his head slightly, as if to say, I see you. I won't look away. After that night, Ryan began leaving the chair by the door. Never locked, never shut tight. So that Fight could come in whenever he needed. Not for protection, but because Ryan needed a witness. A soul patient enough to sit beside his pain without probing, without touching, just being there. A piece of reality to anchor him through the storms he couldn't name. There were nights Ryan bolted upright in panic, heart racing beyond control, breaths too short to draw, hands trembling too hard to twist open a water bottle. And Fight, like some old instinct wired into his bones, would come running from the living room, no calls needed, no panic, just climb onto the bed, lie along Ryan's back, spine to spine, breathing slow, deep, steady, reminding him, another heartbeat is here, another life is still alive, and you can find your way back, one breath at a time. Ryan had tried meds, tried meditation, tried breath work, but nothing ever worked like the quiet inhale-exhale of a dog who never left his side when he needed him most. Once, a therapist asked, "Is there anyone you trust completely?" Ryan didn't answer, but that same night, he went home, placed Fight's old collar on his desk, bent a piece of wire into the word trust, and hung it beside the low table where Fight liked to sleep. He couldn't remember when sleeping through the night had become normal, couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when the chest-tightening panic stopped crashing in while driving or sitting in sunlight. But he remembered the first morning he woke, and Fight wasn't beside him. Not because he had left, but because he had curled up peacefully in the other room, confident enough to rest without keeping watch. It had happened naturally, without announcement, like a wound that healed so slowly, the bearer never realized, until the cold returned and no longer stung. Once, he joked to an old friend, "I can't sleep unless I hear Fight breathing beside me." It came out casually. But hours later, he found himself by the window, sitting in silence, watching that four-legged soul sprawled out on the floor. And he realized, it wasn't a joke at all. Fight wasn't just a dog, not just a friend, not a stand-in for a lost brother, not a substitute for something broken. Fight was a witness, a key, a quiet force that had slowly unlocked every sealed door inside Ryan. Doors bolted shut since the crash, since the sleepless nights, since the days he sat motionless in sunlight and still felt like he was lost in darkness. And because of him, a man who thought he'd never sleep again had rested. A heart once terrified of night had grown still. A spirit once curled in on itself had begun to open, not with words, but with the simple presence of something that stayed. Inside that pale-lit emergency room, under flickering monitors and fluorescent haze, Ryan let out a small smile. Barely a curve. Not even a full expression. But it was the first time in hours his lips had remembered how to move with hope. Because in that moment, when Fight's leg twitched, even if no one else would validate it, Ryan knew the soul that had carried him through every sleepless night was still here. And if Fight had once pulled Ryan from the edge back into the light, then Ryan would do the same now. He would stay. He would hold the paw. He would breathe slow. He would not rise. He would not speak loudly. He would not force. He would simply stay. Just like all the times before. Because in their language, love was never something spoken aloud. It was only something proven through the choice to stay, even when the whole world whispered that it was time to let go. There was a summer that year. Not too distant, yet just far enough for everything to become a soft film stretched over memory. Something only replayed when the night grew too quiet and the breath too steady, when Ryan made the decision to leave the city behind, to leave the concrete paths and the ceaseless car horns that never seemed to tire, and the old ghosts that rose every time he opened his eyes. He started the engine of the old pickup, left the map lying open on the passenger seat like a forgotten thought, and brought with him only one certainty: Fight in the back, resting his head against the window, eyes neither fully awake nor truly asleep, as if his soul had long grown used to journeys that required no explanations. That interstate trip had no destination, no schedule, no clock. Each time the sun sank, they stopped. Whenever rain returned, they ducked into roadside diners. Ryan, who once couldn't bear uncertainty, learned not to ask, "When will we arrive?" Because he realized that every time Fight looked at him through the rearview mirror, there was something solid in that gaze, a steadiness that needed no assurance, as if, whether they turned left or right, whether they backtracked or pressed on, Fight would still be there, silent, fully present, and never stepping away. On the 6th day, they arrived at a low forestland on the edge of Colorado, a place where pine shadows danced across the surface of a small lake, where the only sounds were the whisper of wind slipping through tall trunks, and now and then the quick rustle of wild squirrels darting past gnarled roots. Ryan set up camp, lit a fire, and stretched out on a tarp, still carrying the scent of soap. Fight lay nearby, unchained, unmuzzled, without command, lifting his head only when a sudden sound broke the stillness, then resting it again on his front paws, eyes half closed, as though the whole world was safe within the borders he was quietly guarding. That afternoon, Ryan planned to head deeper into the woods to collect more dry branches. The sunlight was soft, the wind calm, the earth still damp from the night's rain, and each footstep made a sound as gentle as fabric brushing ground. Fight followed, not close at the heel, not too far behind, just the perfect distance a survivor would keep, following without being watched. As Ryan bent beneath a tall pine to reach for a thick, dry branch, a sound cut through the air, sharp, dry, buzzing close to his ear. Nothing like leaves, nothing like insects. It was a vibration more familiar to instinct than to knowledge. And before Ryan could register what was happening, Fight lunged, without pause, directly toward Ryan's left leg, where a sand-colored snake lay coiled, tongue flicking, tail rattling like nature's cruelest shiver. Fight didn't leap to attack. He leapt to shield, his body arched, spine taut, legs grounded, neck tilted just enough to push Ryan back. A single motion, perfectly timed, close enough to pull Ryan out of reach, yet distant enough not to fully take the bite. The hiss rang out again. The snake recoiled and vanished into the brush. Fight stayed still, panting, ears low, eyes fixed on where danger had disappeared. He hadn't been bitten, or if he had, it had been a glancing blow. But Ryan could never forget that moment. The space between life and death, without a command, without a call, only the pure reflex of unwavering loyalty. That night, Ryan sat quietly by the fire. He looked over at Fight, lying slightly to one side, head resting on a small stick of firewood, eyes half-lidded but ears still alert, as if he knew that if he ever slept too deeply, the world would lose its night watchman. Ryan bowed his head, ran his hand gently along Fight's spine, where dust had once clung, where blood had once dried, where a long scar still whispered of stories no one had ever dared to ask. He didn't say thank you, didn't say you saved me. He said only one thing, enough for both of them to understand. If ever you grow tired, just turn around. I'll be standing behind you. From that night on, Ryan no longer woke in panic among the trees, no longer tangled in the thought, what if something happens? Because he knew. Fight would sense it first, would act first, would place his body between Ryan and whatever danger approached. Not out of training, not from discipline, but simply because that is what a soul born to guard has always done. But there are some things that even a soul born to guard cannot hold back. Not because they are too powerful, but because they are too silent. Not enemies from without, but fractures from within. No explosion, no collapse, only a slow, widening crack that seeped into the joints, into the thoughts, into the mornings that no longer wanted to open their eyes, and the endless nights where alcohol was the only way to forget what reason remained to stay alive. Ryan once thought he drank to forget. But it wasn't long before he realized. He drank to switch off everything that still worked, the beating heart, the spinning thoughts, the returning memories. Every bottle uncapped was a film paused. Every gulp swallowed was a whispered lie, just this time. But the next time always came, quietly, decisively, never needing to knock. The apartment grew quiet. calls missed, messages left unanswered, meetings canceled because of a vague not feeling well. And then no one called, no one asked, no one came. Only the pale light of the desk lamp casting shadows on the floor, and bare feet dragging across spilled water too tired to clean. Whenever he was drunk, Ryan often locked the bedroom door, not out of fear of being disturbed, but because he feared being seen, even by a creature who didn't speak, in that state. Collapsed, face down at the bed's edge, mumbling fragmented words about accidents, about guilt, about things that would never return. But even with the door locked, every morning he awoke to the same thing, a shadow stretching across the floor under the crack of the door. A darkness long enough to match the form of a dog curled tight, head resting on the rug, unmoving. No whines, no scratches, no knocks, just stillness, like a message written in the bloodstream. I'm waiting. One morning, Ryan opened the door, still groggy, still unsure who he was, the taste of stale beer clinging to his throat. And there was Fight, eyes open, not jumping, not wagging, simply rising, stepping forward, not to lick or nuzzle, but to brush his shoulder gently against Ryan's knee. Once, just once, before turning away, as if to say, I know you're still alive. That's enough. There were weeks when Ryan didn't eat. He only drank. There was a time he collapsed in the bathroom, his face striking the porcelain sink, a trail of blood running from his forehead down to the collar of his shirt. And when he came to, Fight wasn't curled beside him. He wasn't frantic. He simply stood at the doorway, eyes locked on Ryan, one paw shifting forward slightly, then pausing. No bandages, no reaction. Just standing, like a monument, there to remind him. No matter how far you fall, someone will always see you. The only time Ryan wept fully awake was after one endless, restless night. No alcohol that time, just exhaustion. When he opened his eyes and found a water bowl nudged right up to the bed. Old, scratched, familiar, usually reserved for post-run rehydration. Fight had pushed it there with his muzzle, and now sat by the door, not moving closer, not inviting, not demanding. Just there, as if to say, I bring you nothing but what you need most. Not medicine, not forgiveness, but presence. Ryan couldn't recall the exact day he quit drinking. Only that one afternoon, walking past the cold beverage aisle at a supermarket, he stood for a long time in front of the glimmering silver cans. And Fight stood beside him, eyes forward, posture still. He didn't turn. He didn't stop him. He simply stood. And it was in that very stillness that Ryan's hand loosened. Because somewhere deep within, Ryan knew. Had Fight intervened, he would have given in. But because he didn't, Ryan had to choose, and for the first time in years, he chose to stay sober. Inside the emergency room, where antiseptic soaked into the bloodstream like a second pulse, and fluorescent lights ran overhead like rivers with no end, Ryan gently tightened his grip around the paw growing colder in his hands, the very paw that had stood outside his door during the darkest nights of his life. He needed no witness to testify. He needed no miracle confirmed. He only needed Fight, the one who had waited for him to wake, to choose to stay, just one more day. Some things fracture in silence, like the ground splitting beneath your feet without rumble, without sound, with no fanfare, just a slight imbalance in frequency, a tiny misstep in the rhythm of nature. And then everything that once felt solid begins to tilt, as if no foundation had ever truly existed. That day, Ryan and Fight were hiking in the Western National Park, where limestone ridges braided through dry pine forests and narrow canyons dipped into shadowed gorges. They had come at the casual suggestion of an old friend, someone who'd promised a short climb, a night camped on a slope, and the kind of morning where clouds drift beneath your boots. But the friend never arrived. And Ryan, who had grown used to unkept promises, went anyway, because when Fight was by his side, any place could become a place worth living. No reason required. The quake struck at midday. The sky was clear. Nothing warned them. No trembling leaves, no anxious birds, just a jarring shift following a single off-tone call from a crow, and the earth heaved. Not like drunken sway, not like dizziness, but as if a colossal hand had gripped the planet's axis and tilted it off course. Ryan had no time to react. He only remembered being thrown backward down a steep grade, his head cracking against rock, shoulder dragged across a tree stump. Fight had lunged forward, sinking teeth into the sleeve of his jacket, yanking his body just inches away from a newly opened crevice. Then, darkness. When Ryan came to, the light had changed. No longer golden, just the dim blue tint that filtered down from a narrow break in the rock ceiling. Once a trail, now the roof of a collapsed hollow. He didn't know how long he'd been out. Pain hammered at the back of his skull. One eye was swollen shut. His arm was numb and heavy. But the first thing he did was call out, "Fight!" No answer, no bark, just the faint trickle of loose stones. A shallow breath. Then, from the other side of the rubble, a scratch. Once, then again. Slow, unhurried, measured, like a knock in the middle of the night. "I'm here." Fight had found a way through the fracture, a narrow path along fallen rock shards. Beneath his feet, the debris shifted. His coat was thick with dust. Blood streaked one ear. His eyes squinted under the low light. But his body, upright, steady. He didn't sniff Ryan's wounds, didn't panic, didn't seek water. He stepped close, touched his muzzle to the bruised spot on Ryan's forehead, then turned, sat, and waited. As if to say, "I pulled you from the ledge, now it's your turn. Follow me." The escape took 3 days. 3 long days through the belly of a cracked mountain, where wind couldn't reach, where moisture barely kissed the stone, and where silence pressed so deeply that even breathing felt too loud. Ryan couldn't move fast. His swollen arm bled with every climb. Each unstable slope demanded a pause, sometimes hours, just to recover. But Fight never wandered ahead. He moved in increments, just far enough to lead, always turning to check. And each time, Ryan followed. Not driven by hope, but by the unwavering truth that if Fight was still moving, then an exit still existed. One night they sheltered beneath a jagged overhang. Ryan was nearly spent. His flashlight dimmed to a dull flicker. The water pouch was empty. And Fight, drawn by instinct, by ancient sense, by something humans might call a sixth one, circled the cavern. He returned carrying a moss-lined stone, damp from seeping droplets where the rock above dripped slow and steady, like a metronome counting out survival. Ryan didn't ask how he'd found it. He had no strength left for awe. He just drank, small sips, leaning into the cold rock, eyes fixed on the silhouette of a gaunt dog lying a few paces away. Not asleep, not eating, just watching, just keeping vigil. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the narrow path leading to the mountainside finally revealed itself, and sunlight streamed through in a long white strip that fell across the ground like a drawn breath from the sky, Ryan dropped to his knees, body near collapse, strength unwound to its thinnest thread, and when Fight approached, gently tugging at his sleeve with just enough pressure to remind without forcing, just enough time to say without speaking, Ryan found the will to rise again, and kept walking. By the time they reached the first lookout, dusk had painted the sky in fading golds and bruised violets. The rescue helicopter spotted the faint glint from Ryan's phone. A battery nearly drained, but just enough charge to blink one last time. In the arms of the rescue team, Ryan was carried away. And Fight, thinner now, trembling, Fur matted with blood and dust, followed still, unyielding, unparted. There was something Ryan didn't know, not because he failed to see, but because his four-legged companion had hidden it too well. Fight had never once revealed it, not during the long forest hikes, not while climbing over sharp-edged slopes, not when rain lashed down his spine like whipcord, not when the cold morning air made every paw tremble slightly, not even when the footprints pressed into wet soil left behind the copper scent of blood. He never whimpered, never stopped, never turned to seek help. Only walked on, steady as an oak beam, ears upright like sentinels daring the wind to try harder. The only time Ryan had ever wondered was the day Fight stumbled slightly after leaping across a ravine. But then he ran again, chased the ball like nothing had ever made him limp. And Ryan, in that moment, simply thought, maybe it's just a slight strain in his back? He didn't ask. Because Fight made no sound, and neither of them had ever placed conditions on uncovering the parts of themselves not yet ready to be told. Until that autumn afternoon, when Ryan brought Fight in for a routine checkup. The new veterinarian, a young woman named Mira, examining him for the first time, paused longer than expected when her fingers reached just beneath the back shoulder. Her gaze shifted, not in suspicion, but with the quiet recognition of something old. "There's a raised scar tissue here," she said, hand still resting at the spot, eyes looking up at Ryan with the kind of steadiness that waits for confirmation. This was once a deep tear, could have come from a hook or blade, but the strange part is, it was never stitched. It healed naturally, long ago. Ryan said nothing. He had never seen it, never touched it. Because somehow, Fight had always turned away just so during baths, always laid down angled to the other side, always pulled forward using only his front legs during grooming, always slept with that shoulder pressed against the wall, a way of hiding so natural that even the most attentive eyes would miss it. That night, back home, Ryan sat with Fight for a long time. He stroked from his neck down to the spine, traced each line of fur like a cartographer mapping a familiar continent, until finally, he reached it. The scar was raised and unyielding, the length of a finger, slightly pronounced beneath a light touch. Fight didn't turn, didn't pull away, but he didn't look at Ryan either. He just closed his eyes. And in that moment, Ryan understood it was a secret, not a grand one, not the kind born of betrayal or darkness, just a fragment of memory that his companion had chosen to keep for himself. A piece of flesh once torn open, once soaked in blood, once belonging to a dog who had lain motionless beneath a bridge, amid trash and rust-stained iron, 3 nights and days before anyone found him. And yet, after it all, Fight had stood again, had walked again, had taught himself to move evenly, cleanly, without ever letting anyone see where he had fallen. Ryan asked nothing more. He simply placed his hand on that shoulder, no pressure, no examination, no attempt to decode. Only rested it there, the way one touches a memory they are allowed to know, but never allowed to rewrite, not to heal, but to say, you don't have to hide anymore. Now, in the white cold of the hospital room, where the light no longer feels gentle but slices through the remnants of night like a blade, Ryan once again places his hand over that same spot, where the scar still rises even as the fur above has faded with age. Beneath his palm, the muscle still twitches faintly, but this time it does not retreat, does not tuck into the wall, does not vanish. It remains, an old wound laid bare beneath the touch of someone who no longer needs explanations. "You kept it from me all these years," Ryan whispers, eyes fixed on the thin, half-closed slit of Fight's eyelid. "So I wouldn't worry, so I wouldn't feel guilty, so I wouldn't stop walking, thinking you'd been in too much pain." A silent scar. a secret unspoken, a testament to a resilience that never asked to be praised. And now, Ryan knows. He knows that the friend who stood by him through every storm, every season of despair, every sleepless terror, had also endured alone, also survived alone, also walked across distances no one else could traverse. Not because no one wanted to, but because no one ever saw. And it is this, more than anything, that makes Ryan close his grip just slightly around that cooling paw, lower his forehead to Fight's back, to the scar itself, as if offering a wordless vow to the soul who once carried its pain in silence so that someone else could breathe in peace. You don't have to hide anything anymore. And if this time you cannot make it through, then at least don't take that loneliness with you. In those rooms where life is measured in numbers, where every beep from a machine becomes a quiet proclamation of a heart still battling fate, people do not speak much, not because there is nothing to say, but because in such moments, language shrinks into something embarrassingly small when placed beside the truth that a soul is waiting, quietly, to learn whether it is allowed to stay. The monitor continues its rhythm, still the numbers, still the scattered beats like small waves trying to cling to the shore after every crash of tide. Still no improvement, as Dr. Evans had repeated since morning. But what broke Ryan most was not the uncertainty. It was the waiting, not his, but Fight's. Not fully conscious, not fully lost. No struggle, no panic, only stillness, the kind that belongs to someone listening for something they themselves do not yet understand. Ryan remained there, all day, all night, never stepping away, not even once. And in the quiet hush of fading twilight, when the wall lamp flickered on like an instinct wired into the hospital's bones, he opened his backpack, pulled out a piece of paper folded in thirds, its corners wrinkled from time and watermarks, a letter he had never sent, a letter Fight had never needed to hear. But today, he knew, it was time for it to be read. "You remember the night I said I wouldn't keep a journal?" Ryan began, voice neither raised nor slow, just firm enough not to be swallowed by the soft whir of machines. "I said, what's the point in writing when every day just repeats itself? But one night, I wrote. Just once." The paper in his hand trembled, thin as a breath. "Fight, if one day I don't wake up, or if I wake but am no longer myself, could you forgive me? Not because I thought you wouldn't understand, but because I was afraid that if I said it out loud, I might not stay strong." Ryan paused, his eyes resting on the damp lashes before him. He didn't cry. No tears remained. Only the hoarseness in his voice, and a breath that fractured like dry wind stirring ancient dust. "You saved me more than once, not just from cliffs or snakes or falling rocks, but from myself, from the version of me that didn't want to breathe, didn't want to eat, didn't want to keep going, from the version that forgot why he still existed at all." A disrupted line blinked across the screen. Ryan's heart clenched. He waited. The beat returned, irregular, faint, but still there. He kept going. "I never thanked you. Never reached out to stroke your ears when you finally fell into deep sleep, because I didn't want to wake you. But if this is the last time, then I want you to know. I'm still here, like you were, no matter what happens." The letter slipped from his hand and fluttered softly to the floor beneath the bed. Ryan leaned closer, both arms cradling his friend's head, the way someone might hold on to a past that no one else remembers, not to preserve life, but to preserve something simpler, the truth that someone lived, someone loved, someone stayed loyal until their very last breath. And that kind of truth should never disappear. And Fight, within that velvet silence that drapes a stage after the final act, blinked. Once, so faint, so slow, as if to say, "I heard you." Ryan didn't cry out, didn't spring up. He only clutched Fight's paw tighter, like every current of emotion had surged to a single point. Not with words, not with pleading, not with hope, just quiet, patient waiting. Because sometimes what saves a person isn't the hope of being answered, but the grace of being waited for. And that alone was already a miracle. On the night when wind moaned through the window like a melody that had never been given words, Ryan sat at the edge of his bed, one hand wrapped around a bottle of pills. Not for the first time, but for the first time when everything felt silent enough to act. No messages, no calls, no footsteps in the hallway. Only the dark, swallowing every reason, every effort, every fragile beam he'd once hammered into place like rotting stakes, waiting for wind to tear them down. Fight lay near the door, head resting across his front paws, eyes open but unfocused, as if he had long since learned how to recognize the moment when someone didn't want to be witnessed. Ever since the night Ryan shattered a glass in the kitchen, Fight had stopped approaching during those moments when Ryan's gaze turned cloudy. Not out of fear, but because he understood those moments could mistake closeness for intrusion, contact for judgment, presence for pressure. Ryan hadn't planned to write anything. No notes, no explanations, no last words. Because he believed that when existence became so faint it no longer felt like living, then explaining why he was leaving would be pointless. He tightened his grip on the bottle, the lamplight casting sterile reflections across its label. Cold words in clinical font, printed like verdicts. And then, from the darkness, came a sound. Not loud, not sharp, but louder than any word Ryan had ever heard in his life. A howl. Not long, not desperate, not a bark, not a call, but a sound drawn from the very depths of a chest that had never learned to speak, but had always known the shape of despair. It wasn't a sound of pain, nor of fear, nor of panic. It rose instead from a place Ryan had buried. Deep down, where a 10-year-old boy had once stood in a hospital hallway, holding a bag of folded clothes instead of a goodbye hug, learning to stay quiet in pain for fear of being a burden. And now, that howl, from a creature that couldn't tell stories, couldn't voice sorrow, echoed like a bell. Not to stop him, but to remind him. Someone still hears you. Ryan let go of the bottle, not from fear, but because his hand had started to tremble. Not with panic, but with something else entirely, something that cracked open the dam behind his eyes, letting tears fall freely. Without words, without arms around him, without the need for forgiveness. He sank to his knees, face to face with Fight. And something strange, Fight's eyes shimmered too, not tears in the human sense, but wet, glassy, quivering, like the surface of water waiting for a ripple. Ryan had never known if dogs could cry. No one had taught him that. But that night, he believed, if there were ever a moment when Fight revealed the softest part of his soul, it was now. When a creature who knew only silence, only loyalty, only stillness, chose to howl. At the exact moment his only friend was about to give up everything. The cold white light of the ceiling lamp spilled into the corner of Ryan's eyes, where the skin was damp and heavy from having stayed open too long. The entire room felt as though it were covered in a thin sheet of invisible glass, sealing off this quiet space from a world that continued to drift forward outside, a world that now seemed distant, muffled, unreachable, while here, only the sharp, rhythmic bleeps of a machine remained. The sterile scent of antiseptic stitched itself into every breath, and one human hand still rested on the weakened body of a creature who had once known only how to stand unbroken. The door opened, not with urgency, not with force, only just enough to let the hallway light carve a soft outline across the white coat of Dr. Evans. The man Ryan once believed understood nothing beyond precision and probability, nothing beyond diagnosis and data. Evans carried no clipboard. He checked no monitor. He spoke no, "I'm sorry," no, "We've done all we can." He simply stepped to the edge of the bed, fingers laced loosely in front of him, eyes resting on the ears of Fight. No longer upright as they were in the beginning, no longer flickering as they had that morning, but folded quietly now, as if listening from afar to a melody he used to know. "I reviewed his records again," Evans began, his voice low, clipped, but this time untouched by finality. He once had a fractured shoulder, signs of vertebral slippage, neck trauma that should have ended movement. But he lived through it. He once dropped into hypotension deep enough to be declared clinically gone, and still came back. Ryan said nothing. He didn't look away. He only kept his gaze on Fight, as if the one who truly needed to hear those words was the one whose chest barely moved beneath the thin blanket. Evans took one step closer, slow and deliberate, placing his hand upon the cold metal railing of the bed, fingers splayed like a man leaning toward a truth he no longer sought to measure. "There was a time I believed that prolonging cases like this only served to stretch the pain. That time was luxury and cruelty. But now, I'm no longer sure. Not because of some breakthrough in the data, not because the monitor had given them something miraculous, but because the man before him, the one who had never left his chair, never closed his eyes, never asked for anything, was still here, fused into the fading heartbeat before him, unmoved, unshaken, unwavering. Evans looked up, and for the first time met Ryan's eyes, not like a doctor explaining to a family member, but like a man who had spent his life among facts, and now stood face to face with something no textbook had ever prepared him to witness. "We're not turning off the machines, not today." Ryan's fingers tightened around Fight's paw. No reply, no tears, no smile. Only a deeper inhale, the first since he had entered the room, as though his lungs had finally remembered they were once used to hold hope, not just brace for endings. Evans turned to leave. He reached the door, hand on the frame, but paused, his back still toward the bed. "I don't believe in miracles," he said evenly, "but some things live beyond statistics. Like the eyes of a dog who hasn't given up, and the man beside him who never left." The door closed behind him, not with a slam, not with a tremor, but with the kind of quiet that stays, like the echo of an answer finally given, the whisper of permission Ryan had waited the whole night to hear, not from a doctor, but from fate itself. And beneath the thin sheet draped over Fight's trembling form, his chest lifted, faintly, unevenly, but for the first time, with rhythm. At that moment, the clock read 3:17 a.m. The fragile border between night and day, where darkness no longer fully holds and morning has not quite arrived, where the human soul can no longer distinguish between dream and wakefulness, between what it hopes for and what it still fears to name, a place where everything hovers, just long enough to be caught or lost. Ryan sat on the edge of the bed, both hands resting gently on the darkened coat now laced with dust and ash, eyes trained on the near imperceptible lift of Fight's ribcage beneath the cloth, unwilling to blink, unwilling to look away, as though even a single glance elsewhere would shatter this moment like steam vanishing from the surface of dying flame. The only sound in the room came from the monitor, still beeping, now slower, now staggered. Not from weakness, but from a body relearning its own rhythm, no longer obeying medicine, no longer reacting mechanically, but beginning, for the first time in hours, to breathe on its own, to draw air not as a reflex, but as a choice, a quiet declaration that said, "I am still here," not merely as a body that survived, but as a soul that stayed. Ryan bowed his head, not in defeat, but because nothing inside him felt large enough to hold what now pulsed in his chest. A chaos not of panic, but of memory, of the 1,000 unspoken fragments stitched together across time. The first day at the rescue shelter, the winter nights lying side by side on cold floors, the morning fight placed himself between panic and man. The moment Ryan wrote a letter he never dared to read aloud, all of it surged back, not gently, but in a storm that shattered every wall he had built just to keep going. And then, without warning, without announcement, without dramatic pause, fight inhaled, not fast, not loud, not deep enough to break, but whole. One full breath, uninterrupted, a single ribbon of air drawn smoothly through lungs that had been swollen, blocked, and unmoving for far too long. And when that breath reached its end, when it passed through without faltering, without splitting, without stopping, Ryan cried. Not the kind of sob that breaks open a room, but the kind of cry that only happens when something unnamed has lived too long in the chest. A pain no one asked about, a grief no one waited to hear, a wound no one ever saw, but one that never left, like a sliver of glass buried in the palm, never bleeding, but trembling at every attempt to touch something beautiful. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the back of his friend, feeling with absolute clarity the warmth that radiated beneath the thinned skin, subtle but steady, like a thread of life stitched back into place. No one had ever taught him that a single breath could break a man open from the inside, not in anguish, but in release, like a heart that had been clenched too tightly for too long, finally letting go, not out of despair, but because it had been rescued. "You're breathing again," Ryan whispered, his hand still pressed against Fight's chest, where the heart had chosen to beat again by its own will, without chemical command, without electric impulse, without divine intervention, just the simplest thing, the decision to stay. A nurse passed by the doorway, paused to glance at the monitor. She didn't speak. She didn't summon a doctor. She scribbled a quick note in pencil on the edge of her clipboard, then moved on, because there are moments in medicine that do not call for announcement. A steady breath, no matter how faint, is enough for anyone who has watched a soul begin to leave to understand. Not yet. Ryan lifted his head from Fight's back, wiping his tears with the back of his hand, neither ashamed nor stiff. He placed his palm on the top of Fight's head, gently tracing down the bridge of his nose, stopping at that familiar spot between the eyes, where the fur was softest, where familiar wrinkles used to form whenever Fight caught a sound too strange to ignore. At that moment, Fight's eyes fluttered open, not wide, not searching, but a sliver of light crossed the pupil as if somewhere inside a current of memory had stirred, something still unforgotten, waiting in the shadows to be awakened. "Do you see me, Fight?" Ryan asked softly, his voice barely more than breath, a question he might as well have whispered to the air. But Fight blinked once and held it. And for the first time, Ryan smiled. Not out of certainty, not because the story was complete, but because something had begun, the beginning of return. There was no shift in sound within the room, no sudden spike on any monitor. No heart rhythm soared to trigger alarms. No one rushed in with cries of reversal or hope. But Ryan knew something had moved. Small, slow, fragile, like the first snowflake landing on a mirror-still lake, not to break it, not to ripple it, but to leave a trace so faint that only those who truly watch would notice. And in that moment, in a room colored with the cold gleam of steel and muted fluorescent light, surrounded by the unblinking rhythm of machinery performing their daily rituals, Fight, the wordless companion, the unmeddled soldier, the unregistered sentinel, opened his eyes. Not fully, not scanning the room, not locking gaze, But the lids that had once clamped shut, as if buried under the mud of unconsciousness, now cracked open just enough to let the light in, as if his vision had taken the first step away from darkness, slowly, gently, toward a window not yet raised. Ryan leaned in, his heartbeat tightening, not from fear, but from the way every nerve in his body pulled taut, straining to hold the fragile moment in place, not to prove life, but to touch once more what he believed had already slipped away. "You don't have to see clearly," he whispered, his voice steady even as his chest hollowed with every beat. "Just know that I'm here." And across from him, through the thin glass stained by time and medication, Fight's pupils widened. Just a little. Not from light reflex, but as though they were searching for something familiar, something once known, once bonded, not through words, but through that long, deep silence where two breaths become one, where even a blurred gaze is enough to know. You're not alone. Ryan raised his hand, tracing along the bridge of Fight's nose once again, pausing at the center of his forehead, where a single dark patch of fur still stood out like a quiet constellation. He used to call it the guiding star, half joking, half true. Whenever his mind became a maze, whenever his thoughts spiraled into places with no exits, all he needed was one stroke across that star, and the pounding in his chest would soften, the breath would slow, the old howl would return in memory. The sound that once kept him alive, that once stopped him from taking one more step into the dark. "One blink is enough," he murmured, afraid that anything louder would break the delicate thread they had just restored. Just one more blink. But Fight didn't blink. He breathed, longer, fuller, with resonance, with depth. A breath not just to survive, but to respond. The overhead lights stayed unchanged. The IV drip continued its rhythm. The monitor still pulsed with soft waves like an ocean not yet stilled. But the light in Fight's eyes, though hazy, though unfocused, no longer drifted, no longer wandered, no longer disappeared. Ryan stayed exactly where he was, his gaze fixed, as if those eyes were the last map of a journey no one dared redraw, as if letting that gaze slip away again would mean losing everything he had fought to hold on to. Fight blinked. This time, slowly. Not hurried, not rushed, like someone remembering an old melody and trying to sing it again through a throat still choked with silence. Ryan wept, not in a way the movies would portray, not the grand crescendo of screams upon witnessing a resurrection. He simply leaned forward, pressed his face into the hollow of Fight's neck, where breath still trembled faintly, where a thread-thin vein still pulsed the soft rhythm of existence, and cried in a way that made each quiet sob feel like a translation of every word he had never spoken, every moment he had sat in silence because he hadn't known how to say what needed to be said, every time Fight had waited patiently for something to be named, only to be met with a warm hand, a long sigh, and the weight of endurance shared in silence. "You're really here." Fight's eyes closed. But this time, it was deliberate. It had cadence. It carried a quiet trust, the kind that says, "You can sleep now, because the one you've been guarding has not left your side." The lights in the hospital room dimmed to their lowest setting. No one adjusted them. It was simply the passing of too much time, the sensors defaulting to a softness meant to remind those still awake that the world beyond this room had not stopped, only slowed, only quieted, only continued without knowing that in this tiny space, two lives had just returned from a threshold no language could accurately name. Ryan remained still for a very long time. He didn't check the monitors, didn't glance at the clock, didn't pull out his phone, didn't ask the nurse for another blanket. He simply stayed. He simply breathed. He simply allowed his presence to remain steady in the air, where Fight had just chosen to come back. And when the tightness in his chest finally loosened enough to allow a full breath, when the tears stopped blurring the space between them, Ryan whispered, not to Fight, not to himself, but to a voice older than memory, to a sound he had carried since the time before he knew that sorrow could sleep beside a person for years without ever making a sound. My mother once told me, he murmured, voice cracking like wood under slow fire, that people live because someone out there needs them. A sentence so simple no one had written it down. But it had lived inside him. It had guided his every seemingly meaningless decision. It had pulled him back from the sharpest edges of his life. And now, in this moment, it became the last anchor in a sea without shores, where all he had left was a sleeping dog and a lifetime of memories he had never said aloud. She said, "When you feel like you're about to fall apart, don't ask why should I keep going. Just look around and see if there's someone, even just one soul, who needs you to survive their day." He swallowed hard, his hand resting now on Fight's shoulder blade. The place that had once carried backpacks, once weathered entire journeys, once warmed the cold forest floor, once crossed open fields and shelter lines and seasons that welcomed no one. And through it all, Fight had never once left him behind. "And I found that someone, Mom..." Ryan smiled, not from peace, but from the clarity that the truth remained intact. "I lived because a creature looked at me every morning like I was his whole world. I stayed alive through every relapse, every sleepless night, every failure, because there was one gaze that never asked how successful I had to be to deserve love." Fight breathed, not heavily, but consistently. And Ryan placed his hand on his companion's stomach, feeling the rise and fall, like a song without lyrics, where every note was written in the quiet persistence of being. I never said this to him, but today I will, with everything in me that can still be spoken before I fall apart. He bent forward, rested his forehead on Fight's chest, listening for the heartbeat, slow, loyal, steady as a distant drum echoing through an empty forest. "You're the reason I'm still here, Fight, and if I've ever been the reason you came back, then we're not finished. We're only just beginning again." Outside the hospital window, morning had not yet arrived, but the pale gray of dawn had begun to stretch across the horizon. A single shard of light, not yet formed into sun, pushed gently against the heavy lead of night. The first breeze of morning slipped between the leaves beyond the hospital walls, carrying the smell of something beginning, of pollen dust, of fresh air, of hope arriving uninvited. And in that room, lit only by the memory of statistics once written to declare an ending, a pair of eyes opened once more. Ryan still sat there, hand resting on Fight's chest, unmoving, undisturbed, untouched by time, as though nothing else mattered more than guarding the fragile rhythm steadily rebuilding beneath skin, now dry and fur now dulled, where a heart once faded, now tapped against the ribs like the first beat of a drum in the march of one returning from a solitary war. And then it happened. Not loud. Not enough to make anyone spring to action. Not even sufficient to shift the monitors into alarm, but real and unmistakable. Fight's leg, just one, moved. Not a twitch, not a spasm, but a motion, a curling of muscle, deliberate and alive, the kind of signal only those who've held a hope thin as thread can recognize for what it truly is, not reflex, but will. Ryan didn't leap, didn't shout, didn't scramble. He simply tightened his grip gently around Fight's leg, a hold that didn't clutch, didn't tremble, but confirmed through touch what his soul had already begun to believe, that this movement wasn't imagined, wasn't a wish, wasn't a dream. It was real, and it was the beginning. Ryan turned, Not hurriedly, not with expectation, not seeking another explanation. He didn't need one. "There are moments," he said softly, eyes still fixed on Fight, who at that very instant drew in another slow, deliberate breath, "when maybe he didn't need to be rescued. He just needed someone to wait long enough for him to want to return." Evans didn't argue. He nodded, not out of obligation, not to concede, but because, perhaps after all these years spent measuring life in charts and numbers, this was the first time he had witnessed a heartbeat decide to keep going, not because of treatment, but because someone had remained, had refused to leave, even after being told it was time to let go. And just then, through the slight gap in the hospital curtain that had never fully closed, the light of dawn began to enter. Not blinding, not rushed, not competing with the sterile glow that had dominated the room through too many long hours. The light moved slowly, as if it too understood that this room could not be woken by force, and crept along the tiled floor, then over the edge of the steel bed frame, then across the hanging IV tube, then gently up the rising chest of Fight, and finally came to rest at his neck, where the fur moved ever so slightly in time with breath, where Ryan's hand had stayed all night, unmoving. This first light did not draw the line between life and death, but it revealed something even the night had not been able to name. A moment of return. Not spoken, not acted. Simply seen, in the way the sunlight reached the eyes of a dog opening them for the first time after a battle fought in silence. And he saw the only person who had waited. Fight blinked, once, not quickly, but with clarity. And then, for the first time since being brought into the emergency room, he began to lift his head. Not with force, not with assistance. The neck strained, the chin slid out of Ryan's palm, the front legs trembled slightly, but the head rose and did not fall, pointed steadily toward the light. Ryan did not move. He only shifted his gaze from the hand that had held so much uncertainty to the eyes that once glazed over from sedation, once faded from fever, once closed like a farewell still lingering, and now were open, unfocused, yet unmistakably alive. No one else was there. No nurse on duty witnessed it. No camera recorded it. No applause echoed. No miracle alert sounded. Only a man, who had once sat beside the hospital bed like a man defeated, now looked up, not speaking, not weeping, not reaching out, simply remaining, eyes locked on the friend who was slowly coming back from a place no one believed return was possible. "Can you see me, Fight?" No reply was needed, because that gaze, unbroken, steady, directly held, was the answer. Not just I see you, but I know you stayed. Not just I survived, but I chose to stay. Ryan pressed his lips together, his hand tightening into a fist, as if every drop of blood had rushed into that single point to hold back the flood that had been building inside him, to protect the moment, to keep it whole, to not let it fracture beneath the weight of everything that had led to it. And then, Fight moved again. He pushed his front paw forward, just slightly. Not a step, not a crawl, just a shift, enough to drag the sheet beneath him, and then his tail trembled, not lifted high, but with direction. A beam of light, as if guided by intention, landed at that very instant, touching his chest and foreleg, painting his fur in shimmering gold, not with digital filter or color correction, but with the unedited light of the real world, arriving exactly on time to etch into memory a moment no science could name. Ryan exhaled, long, steady. His eyes needed no wiping, because what welled up in that moment was no longer tears. It was contact, pure and whole, with something never before named. It was the first time in his life he believed that there exists such a thing as a heart that chooses to stay. And Fight had chosen, not to let anyone else decide for him. He looked at Ryan in the light of a morning not yet fully born, with vision still cloudy but with intention unmistakably clear. This was a reunion, after a journey that had stretched across an entire lifetime. And if you've ever scrolled past words like these, love more, slow down, cherish people while they're here, and thought them cliché, thought everyone says it but no one really means it, then just this once. Don't scoff, don't smirk, don't scroll away too fast. Just try to smile when someone you love steps through the door. Offer a nod, a gentle grip of a hand, a quiet, "Are you okay?" spoken not out of habit but from truth. You don't need to change the world. You only need to begin with a little gentleness, for others and for yourself. Because maybe, in what feels like the most ordinary hour, a soul you love is deciding to stay simply because they know you are still here. And that is not a small thing. That is what holds a life together. Laurel Creek Rescue Center sat still under a sky drained of sunlight. The morning air was heavy. Gray clouds pressed low against the roof, and the wind slipped through the cracks in the old metal doors, carrying with it the sterile scent of disinfectant, the dampness of old fabric, and something else, too, something quieter. The scent of fear that didn't speak. Barks echoed across the kennels now and then, some sharp, some broken, but each one faded like waves hitting cold rock. The place wasn't loud, just weighed down. Mira Callan pulled her hood a little tighter as she stepped through the familiar gate after weeks of being away. She didn't say anything, just nodded once at a volunteer walking past. Mornings like this, when the world hadn't fully woken, were when she felt the silence in these animals most clearly. It wasn't just loneliness. It was abandonment, sitting thick in the air like dust that wouldn't settle. Michael, the center's manager, appeared at the end of the hallway. There was something different in his eyes today. Mira hadn't said a word yet, but his voice came low and serious. "There's a new one. Came in last night, not like the others." That was all he said, and somehow it was enough. Mira followed him through the kennel corridor past the dogs she knew by name, each one with a history, a rhythm to their breathing, eyes that followed her just long enough to say, "I'm still here." But as they turned into the isolation wing, all the noise vanished. It was like stepping underwater. Stillness, heavy, thick, as if the air didn't want to be breathed. Michael stopped at Kennel 17. "He's in here," he whispered. "Hasn't moved. Not once." Mira stepped closer. At the farthest edge of the cage, almost swallowed by the dim light and the worn brick wall, was a shape, curled in on itself. Gray-black fur, matted with dust and stiff like straw. Bones showed under the thin layer of skin. Ears pinned down. Lifeless. Eyes half shut, breathing so faint it was barely there. Shadow. A German shepherd once bred for service, for loyalty, for protection. Now, just a shadow of that promise. A soul that had retreated so far into itself, it wasn't sure if it wanted to come back. Mira didn't speak. She didn't knock on the gate, didn't crouch or call out softly like the others always did. She just sat down, not close. But not far either. Just enough space for the silence to rest between them without fear. Her hands rested on her knees. Her eyes stayed fixed on the corner. The wind came again, slipping through the empty hallway, rattling the edges of something unseen. But Mira didn't move. And neither did Shadow. They sat like that. Two quiet dots at the end of different stories, somehow now sharing the same frame. One was a woman still learning how to believe that time could heal. The other was a creature so broken, so forgotten, it had stopped remembering how to tremble. And for that moment, neither of them tried to fix anything. They just stayed. Together. In the stillness. No one spoke. No one moved. No signals, no sounds. Just presence. Simple. Still and silent. That's where it all began. Michael stepped away for a moment. When he came back, he was holding a worn file. The corners were bent. The paper edges had softened from time and avoidance like no one wanted to touch it again. He handed it to Mira. "This one, it's not going to be simple." She took it without a word. Opened the first page. The name was written in thick black ink. Shadow German Shepherd. Male, estimated age 5. Below that, a series of short, heavy words sat like stones on the paper. Confiscated from illegal breeding facility, caged for 4 consecutive years, no access to yard, no social exposure, no training, no contact with grass, no name called, no hugs, no touch. Every time the cage opened, it was a jolt. An electric prod, a plastic rod, or a stranger's hand grabbing the scruff without care. Mira turned the page quietly. Photos of the scene. A metal crate so narrow Shadow could only stand or lie down, never turn, never shift. A note written in the margins read, "No pain response, no reaction to touch." She flipped to the last page. One line had been marked in red. Behavioral rehabilitation not recommended. Social recovery likelihood low. Michael sighed under his breath. Forensics said he's shut down. No growling, no barking, no defense, no survival instinct. Just gone. Mira closed the file. She didn't nod. Didn't argue. Just placed the folder gently on the bench beside her, then lowered herself back onto the cold tile floor right in front of Kennel 17. Again. She didn't lean back, didn't fold her arms, didn't move closer to the bars. She just sat there like someone sitting beside a friend who was too tired to be seen, but didn't want to be left alone either. Then, with slow care, she placed her right hand down on the floor. Palm down. Resting softly. No reaching out. No coaxing. No pressure. Just a quiet message. Too soft for sound. I'm here. Inside the kennel. Shadow didn't move. But if you looked closely, really looked, you might have seen the fur near his neck shift ever so slightly when a soft breeze passed through the hallway. And in that same moment, something stirred in Mira's back, not from the cold, but from the sense that the silence was alive. A young volunteer passed by, her footsteps slowing as she caught sight of them. Mira, still as stone, facing a cold metal kennel. The girl smiled faintly, shook her head gently like she'd seen this kind of patience before, and kept walking. Maybe, in the back of that volunteer's mind, a familiar thought echoed. Another new person thinking they can change what can't be changed. But Mira didn't look up. She stayed right where she was, eyes steady, quietly watching the curled shadow in the far corner of the kennel. Not waiting, not hoping. Just being there, like a tree branch that never demands a bird to land, like a small lamp in a cold room not asking anyone to come closer, but staying lit anyway. And Shadow, though he hadn't moved an inch, was breathing. Barely, but deeply. The kind of breath that belongs to a creature who hasn't fully given up, even after 1,000 breaks. A kind of breath that says, somewhere, in the smallest corner of me, there's something left. Time passed without sound. Through the back window of the hallway, morning light slowly shifted from dull gray to pale gold, then deeper, warmer, like honey spilling across cold tile. The center filled with its usual sounds, leashes clinking, dogs barking in bursts from the other rows, kennels opening and closing, footsteps trailing back and forth. It all blended into the everyday rhythm of Laurel Creek Rescue. But at the far end, Kennel 17, the silence held. No barking, no growling, no whines, no scraping at the bars. Just silence. Mira stayed seated, back straight, head tilted slightly, eyes still on the dark figure pressed tightly against the wall. She didn't check her watch, didn't shift her position. Her breaths came in slow and left even slower, like her whole body was learning how to exist quietly, without intruding on the fragile stillness just beyond the gate. A few more volunteers walked past. Some glanced over, then turned away. They were used to these first days, used to watching new volunteers spend an hour or two trying, then give up. Used to them retreating to friendlier dogs, easier cases, wagging tails. But Mira didn't move. She didn't speak, didn't sigh, didn't show disappointment. Only once, as the sun began to lean to the far side of the roof, casting longer shadows on the floor, did Mira lower her head slightly. And in the softest whisper, more breath than sound, she said, "It's okay, Shadow. No one's going to make you do anything." The words didn't come like commands. They weren't meant to be heard by just any ear. They were delicate, so light, that only someone ready would catch them. Shadow didn't turn his head, didn't move, didn't growl. He didn't whimper. But something wasn't the same as the morning before. He wasn't curling tighter anymore. He wasn't trembling every time a kennel door slammed or a leash clinked down the hallway. Shadow was still a shadow, yes. But this time, he wasn't hiding. No one else noticed. Everyone was busy, walking dogs, cleaning cages, talking to visitors hoping to adopt. Life moved on in the usual rhythm of Laurel Creek. But at the far end of the hall, none of that reached the quiet space between Kennel 17 and the girl sitting cross-legged on the cold tile. Mira and Shadow. Two souls saying nothing, listening in the only way they knew how, through distance. The chill from the floor had crept through Mira's pants. Her knees were stiff. Her ankles had gone numb. But she didn't move. She didn't lean back. She didn't leave. Because Mira knew when a soul has been shattered, sometimes just being there is its own kind of rescue. The sun had started to shift, casting narrow slants of light through the hallway's rear windows. It painted the floor in hazy golden triangles. The day kept drifting forward, but Mira stayed where she was, and Shadow still didn't move. Yet somehow he no longer felt invisible. There were no obvious signs, nothing loud, nothing even noticeable to anyone else. No camera would have picked it up. But Mira felt it in her chest, in her breath, in something deep and quietly human. Shadow was listening. The next morning, the sky still hadn't found its color. It hung gray and groggy above Laurel Creek. Outside the entrance, last week's snow had melted into shallow pools across the cement. There was no wind today, no moaning through the doors, just a cold that clung quietly to the ground, soaking slowly into the bones of the building. Mira stepped out of her car, a small cloth bag in her hand. Inside were just a few pieces of boiled chicken plain, soft, warm, no salt, no sauce, not meant to train, not meant to reward, just something gentle. A quiet hello, without words. Inside the center, the air was the same. That faint antiseptic sting clung to the walls, blending with the morning barks of dogs waiting on breakfast. Mira didn't rush. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't make eye contact. Her steps were steady, familiar. She walked straight to the back, to the place she already knew by heart. Kennel 17. Shadow was still there. Still that unmoving shape pressed into the far corner. Still not looking up. Still melted into the gray of the floor and wall like he wanted to disappear completely. To anyone else, the kennel looked empty. Mira didn't speak, didn't get closer. She sat in the same spot she'd chosen yesterday, the same careful distance, not too near, not too far, just enough to be felt but not feared. She set the cloth bag down slowly on the ground. No sudden movement, no dramatic gestures. With a quiet grace, she opened it and reached inside. Her fingers curled gently around a piece of chicken, holding it in her palm for just a few seconds. She didn't wave it, didn't stretch it forward. She just let it sit there, warm against her skin, letting the faint scent drift softly into the cold, still air between them. Not an offering, not a test, not a bribe, just something warm, something kind, something that didn't ask for anything in return. She placed the piece of chicken on the ground, about 1/2 meter from the gate. Not too close, not reaching in, just far enough for the scent to drift gently into the shadows, carried by the hallway breeze. Just close enough for Shadow to notice, without feeling intruded upon. Time moved slowly, as if it too was waiting for something soft to unfold. At first, nothing happened. Shadow didn't move. His head remained low, tucked into himself, his spine curved tight, like his body was still bracing against a world that had never been safe. But then Mira saw it, the first shift. A flick of his ear. Subtle, almost nothing. She couldn't tell if it was the sound of movement or the faint smell reaching him. But it wasn't reflex. It wasn't random. A few seconds later, Shadow's nose lifted, just slightly, barely a breath above the floor. Then stillness again. But Mira saw it. She didn't look away, didn't lean in, didn't adjust her posture. She just stayed calm, steady, like waiting for a snowflake to melt in its own time. Then his shoulder twitched, just once. His body didn't look as locked as before. The stiffness in his frame had softened just a little, like a current of warmth had reached the edge of something long frozen. Mira didn't smile, didn't sigh. She only watched, deeply, quietly. And then his eyes lifted. Not for long, not with strength, just for a second. But in that fragile blink of time, Shadow's gaze met hers. Not sharp, not bold, but real. It didn't last. It didn't need to. It was enough. Enough for Mira to feel something unspoken settle in her chest. A truth that needed no words. Shadow knew someone was here. For him. Mira didn't speak. But inside, it was like wind chimes stirring on a porch when no one's around. He knows I'm here now, she thought. Day 3. The cold hadn't left. The rain had turned to snow overnight, then melted just enough to leave behind a muddy blur across the entrance path to Laurel Creek. The puddles didn't freeze again, but the chill still clung to every breath. Mira arrived earlier than usual, the same soft cloth bag in her hand. No one asked her where she was going. She didn't explain. She simply walked. Straight to the back, her footsteps pressing a steady rhythm into the tiles beneath her. Kennel 17 was quiet, as always. Shadow was lying on his side, eyes half closed. He didn't lift his head, but his ears they tilted, angled toward her, not sharply, not startled, just familiar. As if the sound of her steps had carved a small place in his memory. Mira didn't rush. She didn't sit down right away. She stood there for a moment, letting her breath find its rhythm again. Only when the space felt still enough did she lower herself, slow and deliberate, knees to the floor, the cloth bag unfolding quietly in her lap. Every movement gentle, every finger speaking a language made of calm. She reached in and pulled out another piece of chicken. Let it rest in the center of her palm. She didn't offer it yet. Didn't set it down. Just let it sit there. Let the scent rise and drift, mingling with the cool morning air and the mist that still lingered in the hallway. Not a promise, not a test. Just something warm, waiting. Shadow didn't flinch. He didn't back away either. Instead, his nose twitched more clearly than the day before. A deeper inhale, thoughtful and slow. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't fear. It was something almost delicate, like a thread pulled taut in midair. Shadow was thinking. Mira didn't look straight at him. She turned her head slightly, eyes drifting toward the far end of the hallway, as if lost in something else. But inside her chest, her heart beat with the kind of care that felt less like nerves and more like reverence. Then, it happened. Another movement. Slow, but undeniable. Shadow lifted his head off the cold tile. His front legs braced slightly, finding balance. His shoulders shifted, his spine uncurled. For the first time since he arrived at Laurel Creek, Shadow pulled himself upright by choice. Mira didn't move. Her breathing remained calm, steady, like wind brushing lightly across the surface of a lake. She knew one wrong move, one direct glance, and everything might collapse back to the beginning. Shadow stepped forward. Each inch carried the weight of years, like the floor beneath him wasn't fully safe yet, like it might vanish at any moment. But he kept going, quiet, careful, until his nose reached out, slowly, towards the gate. The piece of chicken still sat there, untouched. Mira let her eyes fall gently, not staring, not pressing. Her hand rested palm down on the ground, a quiet promise. No rush, no pressure. Shadow dipped his head. He touched the chicken with his nose. Just for a moment, a second. Then he pulled back, quick, not startled, just guarded, like someone still unsure if they were allowed to want anything. He didn't eat it. He didn't stay. But he touched it. And Mira didn't chase the moment. She didn't move, didn't breathe deep or lean in with praise. She simply sat there, and a small smile, quiet as a sigh, crept into the corner of her mouth. Because today, Shadow had reached out. He hadn't just smelled or listened. He had made contact, however brief, however cautious. It was still a choice, and it was his first. Day 4. The wind had softened. Still cold, but not cutting more like the kind of cold that settled in slowly, that lived beneath your skin instead of biting through it. The sky stretched in a pale gray silence. No rain, no sun. Just a stillness that blanketed everything like a deep-held breath. Mira walked into Laurel Creek with steady steps. She carried the same cloth bag, the same soft weight in her hand. But her stride no longer carried hesitation. She was familiar now with the silence, with Kennel 17, with the dark figure that once tried to disappear into the walls. The morning hallway was quiet. A leash clinked faintly from the far rows, but it didn't touch the quiet Mira carried with her. She knelt down gently. No rustle, no rush, just a presence returning to where it belonged. Same spot, same posture, like a rhythm etched into her bones. Mira didn't try to surprise him. She wasn't hoping for something new. She was just there, steady, soft as breath. Shadow lay curled, head resting on his front legs, eyes barely open. When Mira arrived, he didn't turn away, didn't pull back, but his ears shifted toward her, that quiet, familiar signal. No fear, no resistance. She reached into the cloth bag, took out one piece of chicken, and placed it in the same spot as before, right at the edge of the gate. Not closer, not farther. Every inch chosen with care, measured with respect. Shadow lifted his head. Not fast, not urgent, but something was different now the hesitation was gone. He pushed up gently, slid forward across the tiles, and picked up the chicken in one smooth, confident move. Then began to back away, but this time, before he could fully retreat, Mira slowly extended her hand forward. Not high, not close, just enough to turn her palm upward, open toward him. A quiet invitation, no sound, no pressure. Shadow paused. 2 minutes passed, then 3, then 5. Stillness wrapped around them like a blanket. No movement, no sound, just presence. A girl and a dog, separated by inches and years of hurt. Somewhere in that small space between them, something unspoken was mending. Then, like breath escaping into cold air, Shadow stepped forward again. He didn't look her in the eye. He didn't lunge for food. He didn't lower his head in submission. He simply brought his nose close to that open palm. Close enough for Mira to feel his breath touch her fingertips. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch or lean in. She just stayed. Present. Uncrowded, uninviting in the loud way, but wide open in the quietest one. And then, something no one had expected. Shadow touched her hand. His nose pressed gently into her palm. No trembling, no panic, just a moment of trust, resting in the space where fear used to live. It was the gentlest touch, like early wind brushing across still water, like a single drop of dew settling on new grass. No rush, no force, just a touch. And then Shadow pulled away. Not in fear, not in panic, not curling into himself like before, but with a quiet kind of grace, as if to say, I tried. And for today, that's enough. Mira didn't speak. She looked down at her hand, the place where his breath had lingered, where a warmth, soft and faint, still lived like a whisper. To anyone else, it would have seemed like nothing. But to her, it was everything. She whispered, not for Shadow to hear, but for herself, for the moment. Thank you, Shadow, for choosing today. The morning of day 5 was still cold, but it didn't bite the way it had before. The snow had stopped falling. What remained was a thin sheet of ice stretched quietly across the sidewalk in front of Laurel Creek. The wind still slipped through the cracks in the metal doors, but it no longer howled. It simply lingered like a sadness that hadn't fully left. Mira arrived earlier than usual. No gloves on her hands. She moved softly down the hallway, carrying the same small cloth bag. The barking from the other kennels didn't distract her. Her eyes stayed locked on the end of the row on Kennel 17. The same kennel that, even now, no one else had entered. Only her. Shadow was lying down, head resting gently on his front paws, eyes half closed. When Mira stopped in front of his gate, one of Shadow's ears twitched. He didn't lift his head, didn't turn away, but he didn't hide either. Familiarity had begun to take root. Mira sat down. Same spot, same distance. No rush, no eagerness to close the space between them. She opened the bag, pulled out a piece of boiled chicken, placed it near the gate, without a word, without any noise, just motion, just presence. Shadow didn't wait long. Within seconds, his body began to slide forward. His nose sniffed the air softly before reaching out. Then, just like that, clean and sure, the piece of chicken disappeared. No hesitation. No retreat. Mira stayed still. Only after Shadow had started backing away did she quietly extend her hand open, gentle a little closer than yesterday. Not enough to press, just enough to invite. There was nothing in her hand, no treat, no signal, no expectation. Just bare skin, pale with cold, resting near the gate like a breath laid on the floor. Quiet, slow, honest. Shadow paused. Shadow kept his nose low to the tile. His eyes never lifted, but something about his stillness had changed. He didn't retreat like before. He didn't fold back into the familiar dark corner. 1 second, then 2, and then. Shadow inched forward. Just a little. Just enough for the warm, damp tip of his nose to touch the tips of Mira's fingers. She didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't shift her breathing. Her skin was cold, but Shadow's knows it was warm. In that moment, nothing big happened. There was no triumphant bark, no magical leap, just a single delicate touch, soft as early winter fog brushing against a coat sleeve. But in that one fragile second, Shadow experienced something he hadn't known in over 4 years, the freedom to approach a human, without getting hurt. After a few quiet breaths, Shadow stepped back. Not far, and this time he didn't crawl into the shadows. He lay down. Back to the gate, like always. But his spine no longer hugged the wall. His body turned slightly outward, just enough to stay listening. Mira watched him. Her hand stayed where it was. Open. Still. On her fingertips, the memory of warmth lingered fleeting, soft, real. No one said a word. But something had shifted. She was no longer just the one who brought food. And he was no longer just the dog with a red mark beside his name, the one labeled beyond saving. Between them now, there was something new. Trust, even if it was only the beginning. Around noon, Laurel Creek always felt quieter. The sun slipped through the dusty skylight at the end of the hallway, casting pale golden lines across the tiled floor. The air held still, just the low hum of the ventilation fans and the steady rhythm of dogs breathing in their cages. Mira sat like she always did. No gloves, her hand resting softly on the floor, a gentle offering, just far enough not to frighten. She didn't bring expectation, only presence. Steady, patient, like a heartbeat. And Shadow watched her. Even though he didn't move closer, Shadow's ears stayed slightly raised, his gaze fixed on Mira's open hand. His body wasn't curled up like before. He was still cautious. Yes, but it was a different kind of caution now. Like a door that had cracked open but wasn't ready to swing wide just yet. Then, out of nowhere, a loud bang exploded down the hallway. The emergency exit had slammed open, yanked by the wind. It hit the wall hard, the metal-on-metal sound slicing through the quiet like a whip across steel. Cold air blasted down the kennel row, sharp and bitter, laced with the scent of rust and old chains. Shadow jolted. His whole body clenched, tail tucked tightly under his belly, ears pinned flat, eyes wide, frozen, upper lip pulled back just slightly, teeth clenched tight. In that split second, Shadow wasn't in Laurel Creek anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere behind him, buried in the years, somewhere where loud meant pain, where doors meant danger, where kindness didn't exist. No chicken, no warm hands, just ropes, poles, screaming. But this time, something was different. Mira didn't panic. She didn't shoot to her feet. She didn't call out his name like the world was ending. She simply slid her hand a little closer to the gate. Slowly, quietly. Opened her palm like a flower blooming in frost. She didn't say much, just gave a signal ancient and new all at once. Shadow didn't move toward her, but he didn't run either. He didn't dart to the back, didn't press his body into the wall. He stayed where he was. Tense, yes, coiled tight. But his eyes, they never left her. Ears still flat, body still curled. But his eyes stayed on Mira. No blinking, no growling, no flinching. The distance hadn't closed, but something in his gaze had shifted. It wasn't just fear now. It wasn't just survival. It was recognition. Shadow knew. Mira wasn't the sound of the slamming door. "It's just the wind," Mira whispered, voice soft as dust floating through a shaft of light. "Not the old hands? Not this time?" She wasn't speaking for him to understand. She just needed to believe it herself. That maybe her presence was starting to leave a mark. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Shadow slowly began to loosen. His body still leaned, but the tension was fading. He didn't look away. His eyes stayed on Mira, watching. A little unsure, but no longer expecting the worst, and Mira stayed still. Completely still. There was only light now, slipping in at the end of the hallway, a soft streak resting in a pair of eyes that were just beginning to remember the way back to trust. That morning at Laurel Creek felt different. No more gray skies, no more bitter wind slipping through every crack. Today there was sunlight, the first after what felt like endless days of quiet heaviness. It was thin, delicate, like a thread of gold weaving through the fogged glass at the far end of the hallway. It angled just right, slipped through the iron bars, and stopped. Right at Kennel 17. Mira arrived like always. Steady steps, no rush. The cloth bag in her left hand, her right bare. As she passed each kennel, she met the dog's eyes with gentle glances. No stops, no words. Only one destination, the familiar shadow at the far end, lying still, ears tuned to the rhythm of her walk. Shadow didn't lift his head. But when Mira sat down, his muzzle shifted forward just slightly. Like her presence wasn't new anymore. Like it belonged. No greeting? No sound? Mira placed a small piece of chicken by the gate. Shadow came to it. Slow, measured. No fear. No rush. Because Shadow had learned no one here was going to take it from him. And then, as if following a quiet ritual, Mira extended her right hand. Open. Palm up. Just close enough to be felt, not forced. Outside, the breeze was so soft it couldn't even stir the leaves. Between them, the air felt still like a painting. Shadow glanced once, then moved. Paws forward, nose down, every inch deliberate. He touched her hand, not with speed, not in surprise. As if it was always meant to happen. But this time, Shadow didn't pull away. Mira held her breath, just barely, watched from the edge of her vision. Her hand didn't move, but her skin felt it, the warm breath, the soft dampness of his nose resting in her palm. It felt almost unreal, like some quiet soul was asking her, "Is it safe now? Can I stay?" 5 seconds, then 10. Shadow still didn't move. Mira, slowly, gently, folded her fingers in. Not to hold, not to trap, just to cradle, like the wind wraps itself around a blade of grass, soft enough not to make it tremble. And Shadow stayed. For the first time, Mira felt something return from all that trust she had offered. Not in barks, not in steps, but in stillness. The kind of stillness that speaks louder than anything. Like a child who doesn't smile, doesn't talk, but lets you hold their hand. Just that, and the whole world shifts. The sunlight spilled through the foggy glass at the end of the hallway. A thin beam no more than the width of a hair stretched across the cold gray floor, landing quietly where Mira sat. And in that sliver of light, there was a wet nose, an open hand, and a distance that no longer felt like a wall. No words were spoken, but both of them, woman and dog, knew it. That sunlight wasn't just light. It was a line, a fragile border between fear and hope. Just crossed. So soft you might miss it, but deeper than any promise. The 6th morning. The sky over Laurel Creek stayed heavy with its familiar gray, but at the far end of the kennel row, light still fought its way through the dirty pane of glass. A pale square of warmth spilled onto the old tiles, resting just outside Kennel 17. Mira entered, just like always. She didn't speak, didn't look around, just walked straight ahead to the corner where the same dog, the same Shadow, always waited. But today, Mira paused. Shadow wasn't curled up with his back turned, wasn't pressed into the corner like a secret too ashamed to be seen. Shadow was lying on his side, his head slightly lifted, his eyes looking right at her. No barking, no whining, no flinch, just watching. Mira knelt down. Slowly. She didn't reach for him, didn't open the bag right away. She just placed it gently beside her and let out a breath that felt softer than anything she could say. Then Shadow rose. He didn't wait for chicken, didn't hesitate like he used to. Shadow stood. His legs trembled faintly, but he stood. And he walked. 3 steps, that's all. But for Mira, those 3 steps were more than any hug, more than any thank you. They were everything. She opened her palm again, the way she had for 5 days straight. No sudden moves, no calling out, just her hand, resting in the space that had become theirs. And Shadow came to it. No fear, no bracing. He lowered his head, pressed his nose into her hand. Warm. Damp. Real. But this time, Shadow didn't pull away. He stayed, like he was saying, without words. There's no danger here. Not with you. Mira didn't move. She only curled her fingers slightly, not to hold, not to claim just enough to make a gentle circle around that warm, damp nose resting in her hand. Not to control, but to say, I won't let go unless you're ready. 2 breaths, quiet and steady, overlapped in that fragile space between them. 1 human, 1 dog, no words spoken. But something larger was unfolding. It wasn't just acceptance anymore. It was anticipation. Mira tilted her head slightly, whispered just above a breath, Good morning, Shadow. And then it happened. Shadow's tail gave a single, slow wag. Just once. Software, but unmistakable. Not because of food, not for a treat. It was a response. A real one. And inside Mira, something stirred something she couldn't quite name. Not joy exactly, not the kind that bursts open. It was quieter than that, warmer, like stepping barefoot onto sun-warmed sand after the longest winter. Shadow sat down. Not against the wall, not turning away, just sitting there, facing her. And between them, silence. The kind that doesn't ask for anything. The kind that makes room for trust to grow. Outside, a single leaf tapped against the window pane. The morning light shimmered on the floor where they sat, shifting gently with every motion of the wind. And Mira knew. This was the first morning Shadow hadn't begun with fear. The 7th morning. The sky hung low again, not storming, just heavy. Cold crept in through every crack in the old walls of Laurel Creek. Overhead, a line of dull lights cast a faded yellow hue down the hallway, making the tiles look darker than usual, like they were holding stories from the night before. Mira arrived like always, but today she carried something else besides the familiar cloth bag of chicken pieces, a soft beige towel folded carefully, not for cleaning, not for making a scene. She sat down across from Kennel 17. Shadow was already up, not waiting, not hiding. Shadow raised his head before Mira even called his name. His legs moved with more confidence now, the stiffness in his back legs still there, but lighter. His eyes were clear, awake. Shadow walked over, not fast, not slow, just steady. Mira opened her hand. Palm up, the same gesture, their quiet morning ritual. Shadow pressed his nose into it again, and this time, he stayed. Mira nodded, then reached into the side of her bag. She pulled out the towel, not toward the kennel, just beside her hand, resting it on the floor within sight. One hand stayed right where it was open, still holding that small moment of contact. Then Mira gently picked up the towel. Her movements were light, almost like drifting air. No sudden flicks, no tension. She started to wipe the floor near the kennel bars, clearing away dust and dried marks, not moving too close, not intruding, just making space. Shadow didn't flinch, didn't back away. He stood still, watching. His breathing was calm. And for the first time, the space between them wasn't just neutral ground. It was being prepared for something more. Shadow watched. Those deep, dark eyes followed every movement Mira made, not retreating, not advancing, just watching as if trying to answer something not with his body, but from a place much further inside. When Mira finished cleaning, she gently set the towel down, withdrew her hand, and let the quiet settle again. A breath passed. Then Shadow raised his head higher. And for the first time since arriving at Laurel Creek, Shadow stood, fully. All four legs planted, no wall to lean against, no shadow to disappear into, just standing tall, alert, and facing Mira. Mira held her breath. Shadow took a step forward. Software steady. Mira lifted her hand again, palm up, open, unwavering. And then it happened. Shadow didn't just press his nose into her palm. He leaned in and gently licked her hand. Just once. But that one touch made Mira's chest tighten, her breath catch. Her whole body trembled not from cold, but from something far deeper. There was no sound in the hallway. No witnesses, no applause, no cameras, just Mira and Shadow. And the look in his eyes softer now, no longer frozen in fear or shut away in some unreachable place. Mira bowed her head, letting her hair fall forward, covering eyes that had quietly filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. She wasn't sure who it was meant for. Maybe for herself. Maybe for him. On the other side of the bars, Shadow didn't walk away. He simply sat, right up against the kennel gate, ears alert, eyes calm, watching the girl who had come every single day and asked for nothing but presence. And somehow, that was enough. By the end of that morning, the halls of Laurel Creek were quieter than usual. No loud footsteps, no chatter, just a stillness like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something fragile and sacred to be honored. Michael stepped beside Mira, his voice barely above a breath. "It's time." Mira didn't speak. She just nodded. Michael stepped forward with the key ring in hand. The lock gave a soft clink, and the hinge, old and stiff, let out a faint creak as he turned it. Slowly, carefully, he eased the metal door open. No sudden movement, just enough to shift the space, just enough to let something in or let something out. The door stood ajar, silent and unassuming. Not a threat, not an invitation, just a possibility. Shadow froze. The old reflex sparked body rigid, ears slightly pinned, one step back. But there was no growl, no defensive crouch, no panic in his eyes, only a pause. A quiet moment, as if Shadow needed time to understand what this meant. Mira didn't move. She remained in her spot, seated just outside the kennel, hands resting gently on her lap, palms open as always. No coaxing. No calling his name. She understood something essential. The choice had to come from him. The step forward had to be his. A small brass bell, hanging from the upper corner of the kennel door, caught a faint draft rolling down the hallway. Ding. A sound so soft, so subtle, most wouldn't have noticed. Shadow flinched. His ears twitched. But he didn't retreat. Instead, Shadow moved forward. Just one step. Carefully. Deliberately. Stopping right at the threshold. He didn't bolt, didn't press himself into the farthest corner. This time, Shadow stood with his paws planted on the dividing line where concrete floor gave way to the open hallway, where confinement met choice. From the window at the far end of the corridor, a thin beam of light slanted down and stretched across the floor, touching that very spot. And for the first time, the light didn't just graze the tiles. It touched Shadow, too. His silhouette extended outward, cast in full on the cool hallway floor. The beam caught the bell's curve, scattering light over the faint fur at his neck. And in that shimmer, you could see it clearly, unmistakably. Shadow was no longer hiding. Mira said nothing. She simply looked at him, her eyes warm, soft, and steady. Shadow turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze. His eyes didn't cloud this time. They didn't flick away. They held still quiet, alert, thinking. The wind stirred again. Ding. The bell sang once more. And something in that quiet, delicate chime felt like permission. No one rushed him. No one ordered. There were no hands pointing the way. Just space, open and still. A stretch of hallway washed in quiet light, carrying the scent of wind, the faint smell of people, and the steady presence of Mira sitting there, just waiting. Shadow stood at the threshold. He hadn't stepped out yet. But for the first time, he didn't want to turn back. That morning, the sky wore its usual soft gray. The hallway at Laurel Creek still smelled of disinfectant, layered with the distant barks from the other kennels. Kennel 17 had been left slightly open overnight. The old metal door didn't creak anymore. That alone was enough to make a few staff glance over. But Mira didn't pay attention to any of that. She walked slowly, her heavy coat falling around her legs. In her hand was the familiar canvas bag. No chicken today, just her scent. Just something familiar. Shadow wasn't curled in the corner this time. He wasn't hiding. He was already standing right in the middle of the kennel, eyes looking straight ahead. And that look, it wasn't hollow, it wasn't afraid. For the first time, Shadow was standing to wait. Mira smiled. Not big, just soft, like a quiet yes to the moment. She didn't say a word, didn't beckon. She simply lowered herself to her usual spot, her hand resting on the cold tile, palm up. Waiting. Shadow stepped one paw forward, then stopped. The guarded look was still there, tight, heavy, but in that split second, Mira saw something shift. It wasn't fear anymore. It was hesitation. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stayed. Then, Shadow stepped out completely. Not fast, not with excitement. One step, then another. His paw landed on the hallway floor. Cold tile. But he didn't pull it back. The sound of his nails tapping against the ground echoed gently in the quiet. Somewhere far down the hall, a few dogs barked, but their voices sounded distant now. Mira sat still, eyes following his every movement. "Good morning, Shadow." The words came out low. Not meant to guide, not meant to reward. Just a greeting. The kind you say to someone you trust. Shadow stood tall, his head lifted higher than ever before, though his body still carried the weight of caution. But he didn't step back. And that was enough. It felt like the beginning had truly begun. Shadow's paw steps echoed softly on the tile floor, a sound as light as wind, but enough to make the people passing by stop in their tracks. For the first time since arriving at Laurel Creek, Shadow stepped out of his kennel not because he was pulled, or called, or coaxed, but because he chose to. One step, then another. Quiet footsteps that somehow felt louder than anything else in the hallway. Mira didn't say a word. She simply walked beside him, keeping a respectful distance. No leash, no commands, no pressure, just a woman and a dog, two beings learning how to exist in the same world again. Shadow didn't look at anyone, but his ears, once pressed tightly against his head, no longer drooped in fear. His steps were still careful, yes, but they weren't the steps of something broken. Each contact of nail to floor was a quiet act of courage. Every movement whispered the same message: I am here. A group of volunteers passed by. One of them stopped mid-step, lifting a hand to their mouth, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Another just smiled, eyes soft, head bowed gently in respect. From the far end of the hall, a low growl and a burst of barking carried over from the kennels, the kind of sound that used to send Shadow into the corner, trembling, hiding from a world that had hurt him. But not today. Shadow paused. He didn't flinch. He didn't shrink. He just listened. His neck stayed upright, ears perked ever so slightly, eyes calm, alert, not running, just taking it in. Mira stopped too. She didn't say his name, didn't offer comfort. She just stood there, letting Shadow process it in his own way. On his own terms. A few quiet seconds passed. Then Shadow turned his head toward the end of the hallway. The light from the therapy garden slipped through the frosted glass, brushing the floor with soft, dappled brightness. There was grass out there, and wind, and something that smelled like freedom. Shadow walked on. Not fast, not fearless, but steady. The air moved through his patchy fur like a gentle hand, and something about the way he walked had changed, not bolder, exactly, but clearer. Each step had direction now. Each breath had purpose. Mira walked a few paces behind, her footsteps quiet, soft like breath. She didn't speak, didn't guide. But inside her, every step Shadow took felt like a bell ringing. I'm choosing to return. As they passed by a tall glass window, their reflections stretched out on the floor. One woman, one dog, no leash, no chain, just presence, just trust. From the security room, a few staff watched in silence. Michael stood near the monitors, eyes tracking Shadow's every move. No one said anything, but the hush in the air said it all. Like something sacred had just happened. Shadow reached the end of the hall. The door was open. And the light poured in across those four paws that used to shake at every clang of the cage. Mira stopped and waited. Shadow turned back to look, not to ask for permission, just to check. Like he was saying, Is it okay if I go a little further? Mira gave a small nod. And just like that, Shadow stepped forward out of the past and into a space filled with sunlight, with wind, with the soft scent of grass, and with someone who had always been waiting. The back door of the center opened straight into the therapy garden, a quiet stretch of space. Not too wide to feel lost in, but wide enough for a fragile soul to finally breathe. The grass looked like a gentle welcome, spreading out like a soft green rug. The white fences were freshly painted. Off in the distance, a few lavender bushes, their blooms now faded to a silvery purple, whispered of a summer that had passed but left behind its scent, still lingering in the cool air. Shadow paused at the edge of the door. One paw stepped out first, right where cold tile gave way to soft ground. Then he moved. His paw sank gently into the grass. Firm, wary. Not from fear, but from unfamiliarity. Shadow lowered his head. Nose to earth. Inhaled. Grass. Soil. Sunlight. Trees. And freedom. There was no metal scent, no mold, no stench of fear soaked into the walls, just the clean, quiet smell of life untouched and real. Mira didn't follow. She quietly sat on a bench beneath a nearby tree, hands resting on her knees, spine tall. She didn't move. She didn't speak. Her eyes followed steady, warm, never asking for anything. Shadow took a few more steps. His legs still dipped low, his body still cautious. But he was moving. He was choosing where to go. Then he turned back. Not scared, not unsure. Just checking in. His eyes met hers. Mira didn't say a word, just nodded again. Softly. Enough. Shadow turned forward and kept going. This time he didn't stop halfway. This time he didn't hesitate. A step, then another. And then he started to run. Not fast, not wild, not because something chased him. It was the kind of run that asked quietly, "Is this what freedom feels like?" He stumbled slightly, one paw sliding on the damp grass. Stopped. Breathed. His ears flicked back for a second. Old instincts still whispered. But Shadow didn't retreat. He didn't curl in on himself. He stood still, took in a full breath, and stayed. Then Shadow walked again. This time steadier, stronger. There was no applause, no cheers, no need for anyone to whistle or praise. It was enough just to know his paws could still feel softness. His nose could still tell the scent of flowers. And his heart. His heart was still beating for something other than fear. Sunlight fell in a slant across the lawn, stretching a golden ribbon across the grass. Shadow's silhouette stretched with it thin. Yes, but no longer trembling. His head was still low, but his ears stood alert. His legs were firm, and his tail no longer curled beneath him. From the bench, Mira watched. She didn't smile wide. She didn't cry. She just sat like she had each morning for the past 5 days with gentle eyes and a quiet belief that didn't need words. Shadow paused in the center of the grass, then turned. This time he looked longer. His eyes met hers. No words were needed. No name called. That look said everything. "Can we walk the rest of this road together?" By late afternoon, the sky above Laurel Creek had turned iron gray. Heavy clouds pressed low, like a hand bearing down on the roof of the rescue center. The wind picked up, slipping through the metal slats of the kennel walls. And by midnight, the sky tore open. Thunder cracked like a whip. Rain poured, thick and relentless. In kennel number 17, where Shadow had been resting peacefully for a week, something shifted. The calm that had settled over that space broke like glass. A deep, guttural bark erupted, raw, frantic. It wasn't a warning. It was panic. Muffled thuds followed, claws scrambling, body slamming against metal bars, a shrill sound that cut through the storm louder than thunder. A night volunteer rushed down the hall. What she saw stopped her cold. Shadow was spinning inside his kennel like a creature caught in a nightmare. Eyes wide, chest heaving, every part of him screaming for escape from something no one else could see. She called his name. He didn't hear it. Or couldn't. She grabbed her phone. 10 minutes later, Mira arrived soaked, her coat still dripping from the rain. She didn't run. She didn't rush. Mira walked slowly to Kennel 17, brushed a few wet strands from her face, then sat down, right outside the door. Shadow hadn't stopped. His breath came in shallow gasps. His eyes weren't seeing the room. He was back somewhere else, somewhere darker, somewhere loud, somewhere filled with pain. Mira reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a small, worn notebook. The corners were damp, the ink already bleeding at the edges. She opened to a page, her voice low, even. Not too loud, but steady. Back then, there was a boy named Liam. He was afraid of thunderstorms. Every time it rained, he'd pull the blanket over his head, but always left one hand out, just one, in case someone wanted to hold it. Her words floated softly in the air. Mira didn't look at Shadow. She didn't say his name. She didn't try to reach through the bars. She just read. Each syllable wove gently through the clatter of rain on the roof, through the growls still stuck in Shadow's throat, through memory, through fear. And slowly, it began to settle, not disappear, but settle. Gradually, the chaos quieted. Inside the kennel, the frantic footsteps faded. The collisions softened, then stopped. Shadow stood still, chest heaving, fur bristling, but all four paws stayed rooted to one spot. Mira didn't move. She paused, looked up at the darkness ahead of her, and continued softly. And one day, a hand touched Liam's. No one said anything, but from that moment on, he never pulled the blanket over his head again. Shadow didn't come closer, but he didn't retreat to the corner either. His eyes stayed open, no longer glazed, but alert, the gaze of someone fighting to stay grounded through the storm of memory. Rain still lashed against the windows, thunder still cracked in the distance. Yet in the middle of that freezing, echoing corridor, two beings sat across from one another. One human, one dog. No panic, no collapse, only breath and presence. Mira gave a small nod. It's okay, Shadow. We're still here. Both of us. From down the hall, the faint glow of the yellow light cast long shadows across the wet floor, two silhouettes, one large, one smaller, separated by just a few quiet steps. And for the first time, that space between them no longer felt unreachable. The next morning, a thin chill still clung to the air. The lavender bushes in the garden hung low, weighed down by rain. Puddles dappled the stone path, catching the dim sunlight like soft glowing mirrors. Mira arrived early. She didn't call out, didn't wave like others might. She simply stepped into the kennel wing, her movement silent and familiar, woven into the rhythm of the place. Shadow's door was ajar, just as it had been the past few mornings, a quiet symbol of earned freedom. But today, Shadow didn't rise to greet her. He lay on his side, breathing slow, his head slightly raised, eyes open but dull, the storm's echo still held in his limbs. It was in the way his back curved, how his paws didn't shift. as if the thunder had never truly left. Mira didn't ask. She said nothing. Instead, she pulled a warm cloth from her coat pocket, lowered herself to the ground just beside the door, and extended her hand toward him. No words, no sudden movements, only breath soft and steady, like wind brushing gently against an old window. She began to clean his paws, one at a time, tender, methodical, not like grooming, but more like wiping the dust from an old beloved relic, as if each motion whispered, "You're still worth care." When her hand reached his belly, Mira paused. There, beneath the coarse, tangled fur, something felt uneven. She tilted her head, gently moved the cloth aside, without touching skin. Just enough to see a scar. Thin, pale, clean. Faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't from a fall, and it didn't come from a fight. This was surgical, a precise line, a mark left by gloved hands and a sterile room. Whatever it had been, something serious had once been taken from Shadow. Or perhaps added. Something deep. Mira exhaled, the sound catching in her throat. She didn't reach to trace it. She didn't need to. She simply whispered so quiet it was meant only for the air between them. Shadow. What did they do to you, to leave something like that behind? Shadow didn't flinch, didn't pull away, didn't turn to hide. Instead, Shadow opened his eyes wider and looked straight at Mira. There was no panic in that gaze, no shame, no walls, only acceptance. As if Shadow was saying, yes, it's real. And in that moment, Mira no longer saw a frightened, reactive creature. She saw a being wounded, enduring who might not fully remember the pain, but carried its shape, written into the skin like a silent testimony. Their eyes met. Not in drama, not in a grand exchange, but in a quiet convergence where truth needed no label and trust asked for nothing in return. Mira folded the towel slowly, set it aside. She said nothing. Because sometimes the biggest questions aren't meant to be asked too soon. Shadow stayed where he was, but now his eyes didn't drift. They stayed with Mira, not guarded, not distant, just tired. And the scene closed with that gaze between a woman trying to understand and a dog who had no words to tell his story. One scar, one moment, one door to memory cracked open, not loudly, but with the kind of weight that stills the breath. That afternoon, sunlight began to slip through the thick cloud cover above Laurel Creek. It wasn't warm, but it was enough to tint the long hallway with a haze of pale gold, like a dream that hadn't decided whether to stay. Mira stood in the record room, asking Michael quietly to retrieve an old file, not the summary. The full set. Everything there was. On Shadow. From the shelves came a worn cardboard box, its edges frayed, the corners soft with time. Inside, stacks of old intake forms, behavioral notes, transfer slips, pages yellowed with age, scribbled annotations in pencil and red ink scattered across the margins. Mira flipped slowly, eyes tracking each entry with care. Her fingers paused often on a red check mark, on a crooked circle, on a hastily added question mark. Then, between two faded transfer forms, a single thin medical report caught her eye. A copy, misfiled, forgotten, from a temporary partner vet clinic. The ink had blurred slightly in places, but it was still readable. It wasn't long, but every line cut like glass. Shadow, during his time at an illegal breeding compound, had not just been overused for forced mating. He had been surgically harvested. The note was clinical, detached. Shadow's ovaries had been operated on eggs taken directly for the purpose of cloning and hybridization experiments. But what made Mira's breath catch was the last line, scrawled in tiny writing. No name attached. Last extraction performed with incomplete anesthesia due to supply constraints. Dog survived, showed violent reaction, required physical restraint. Mira lowered the page slowly. She didn't cry, didn't gasp. She just sat there for a long, long time. Her hand closed gently over her other palm, as if trying to hold on to whatever warmth she could still find, for both of them. She looked out the window. The sky had turned the color of ash. And somewhere deep inside her, a silent rain had begun to fall. When Mira returned to the kennel block, she brought nothing with her. No towel, no treats, just a folder of records and an old wooden chair. Shadow was in her usual corner. Still, awake, head slightly lifted, as if she already sensed something approaching, not a threat, not a command, just something that mattered. Mira sat down. She didn't greet, she didn't reach out. She simply opened the folder and in a calm, steady voice began to read. Shadow, female, approximately 5 years old. Surgical history includes... There was no anger in her voice, no pity, just quiet clarity, like wind brushing gently past an old windowsill. Each sentence wasn't meant to accuse, nor to console. They were truths laid bare. And in reading them out loud, Mira gave weight to what had once been endured in silence. Shadow didn't look away, didn't shrink. Her ears drooped slightly, but her gaze held Mira's. When Mira reached the final line, she stopped. She didn't close the folder, didn't shift her posture. She simply laid it aside and opened her hand, not for a touch, but for acknowledgement. 1 minute passed, then another, and then... Shadow moved. It wasn't fast, wasn't hesitant, and it wasn't for food or a signal. It was just one soft step closer, as if something once frozen inside her had thawed. Just a little. A quiet movement toward the light, toward presence, toward a witness. In the pale light of day's end, a woman sat still, and a shepherd sat near. No words, no movement, no need, but it was clear to anyone who might have seen them. The heaviest part of the past had just been halved, and that made all the difference. Those quiet afternoons that feel like a sigh, that was how the garden behind Laurel Creek felt. The breeze moved gently through the trees, brushing over the soft grass like a hush. Sunlight spilled thin across the lawn, pale and warm, like someone had stirred milk into the air. Mira sat on an old wooden bench, still and calm. One hand rested on her knee. The other slowly stroked along Shadow's back. Shadow was curled at her feet, eyes half closed, breathing soft. The kind of peace you don't dare disturb. The whole garden held its breath. Birds chirped in the trees. A wind chime clicked gently in the distance, like two porcelain spoons clinking together. Everything was still. And then, a scream. Sharp, splitting. It cut right through the calm like glass breaking. And in that 1 second, everything changed. That scream, it wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Quick, the kind of sound that slices through your chest before your brain even catches up. And it was a child's voice. It came from near the fence, where the lavender bushes brushed up against the gravel path. The rain from earlier had left puddles clinging to the stone. A little girl had slipped. She fell onto the edge of the wet grass, her small hands catching the cold gravel beneath her. She wasn't hurt, but her face was frozen in fear. No one moved right away, not a sound, not a breath. Then Shadow moved. No bark, no warning, just motion. A streak of gray and tan across the garden. 1 second, Shadow was by Mira's feet. The next, she was racing toward the scream, toward the girl, like something deep inside had snapped awake. Mira stood, barely whispering Shadow's name. But Shadow didn't stop. Her paws hit the damp earth, tapping light against the brick walkway. And then stillness. She stopped, just a few feet in front of the girl. No growl, no sudden moves, just stood there, like a wall. The little girl's eyes were wide. She didn't cry. Not anymore, just stared, hands clenched around the wet grass, her back pressed to the low fence. And then, something unexpected. Shadow lowered her head. No barking, no tension in her body, no shaking. Just a slow, gentle bow. Her body lowered into a sitting position. Her eyes never left the girl's face. And in that look there was only one message. It's okay now, Mira came running. But when she saw the scene, she slowed. Carefully. She didn't want to break the spell. Shadow didn't turn, didn't move, just kept watching the girl, waiting. Not demanding, not invading, just holding space. The girl's breath began to slow. Her lips were still tight, her eyes still wide but her fingers unclenched. The grass was no longer trapped in her fists. She was still scared. But she wasn't frozen. Mira crouched next to Shadow, placing a gentle hand on her damp back. Shadow didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Her eyes were locked on the child. And in them something had changed. It wasn't the look of a cornered animal. It wasn't survival. It was protection. For the first time, Shadow wasn't guarding herself. She was guarding someone else. Something smaller, softer. Something she saw as worth keeping safe. Then came footsteps, fast, heavy, desperate. A man ran into the garden, breath ragged, eyes wild with panic. He was tall, maybe in his 40s. His coat was soaked at the hem, streaked with mud and worry. His eyes darted everywhere until they landed on her, his daughter sitting on the ground. Alive, whole, safe. Relief hit him like a wave. And then he saw Shadow. In that exact moment, the father's instincts kicked in. He flinched just a little. Not because Shadow did anything wrong. Just because she was big. A German shepherd. Silent, still. Standing between him and his daughter. It wasn't a scream. Wasn't even a full step back. But it was enough. Someone nearby moved like they were about to speak. Someone else shifted like they might rush in. But Mira didn't move. She didn't raise a hand. Didn't call out. She just stood still. And then, something no one expected happened. Shadow didn't react. She didn't bark, didn't step forward, didn't drop into that guarded crouch she used to hide behind. She simply turned around. Slowly. Her eyes went to Mira. Calm. Focused. No fear. No tension. Just a quiet question. Now what? Mira gave the smallest nod. And that was all it took. Shadow stepped back. One step, then another. Until she was beside Mira again, not leaning in, not needing to touch, just there. Like she was saying, I'm still here. But I'll wait. The man watched her the whole time, and for the first time, he really saw her. The strength in that body didn't threaten him now. The way she moved steady, careful, soft, held no danger. He dropped to his knees beside his daughter, gently brushing dirt from her knees, checking her hands, smoothing her hair. She didn't speak, still wide-eyed, but her gaze never left Shadow. And when she finally moved, it wasn't to cry. She just reached out and grabbed her father's sleeve, held it tight, like she was holding on to something she didn't want to lose. The man looked back. His eyes met Shadow's, and there it was, that silent thread. Not fear, not control, but something softer. Shadow stood quietly, her eyes still on the girl. Not protective anymore. Present. Mira didn't say a word. Neither did Shadow. The father took a slow breath. Then, almost cautiously, he lifted his hand. Stopped halfway, hesitated. Just for a second. Then slowly, he reached forward and placed his hand on Shadow's head. No pressure, no force, just a touch, a soft, human gesture, one that said, "I see you, I get it." No one said anything, no one had to. Off in the distance, a volunteer who used to shake their head at Mira when she sat for hours in front of Kennel 17 stood frozen, one hand gripping the fence post. And in that little garden, with lavender swaying and the wind whispering through a wind chime overhead, the world held its breath. Mira turned her face slightly. Because moments like this, they don't crash into you, they don't come with applause, they just land quietly and stay. But Mira's tears spilled over, quietly, without warning. Not because of the father's touch, not even because of what Shadow had done in that moment. It was something deeper than that. For the first time in her life, Shadow had not made someone step back, not because someone promised she was safe, not because of commands or reassurances, but because Shadow had chosen to step forward toward trust. Silently, bravely. The next morning was quiet, heavy with clouds, no wind, just that kind of stillness that lets you hear the sound of shoes tapping gently against the floor. Michael stood beside Mira, clipboard in hand, eyes fixed on the far end of the hallway. There was a door at the end of that hall, one that hadn't been opened in more than 3 months. "The north yard," he said softly. "You think it's time?" Mira didn't answer right away. She turned her gaze to Shadow, who was sitting a few feet away, calm, watching them without flinching. The north yard wasn't just any space. It was where they brought the dogs who were finally ready. No fences, no leashes, just a patch of sky, some dry grass, and a narrow path that led to the community therapy garden. It was a place for those who didn't need walls anymore. Mira took a long breath, then nodded. Not because she was certain, but because she believed. The next morning they didn't announce anything. No crowd, no applause, just the quiet creak of a door being unlocked, slowly, carefully. No one called out. No one held a leash. Just a door swinging open, gently, letting the light pour in. Behind it was that warm brick wall Shadow had grown used to. In front was open space, grass, a wide patch of dry earth, a new kind of silence, the kind that asks, "What will you do now?" Shadow stood at the threshold. No one rushed her, no one coaxed. Mira stood a few feet away, hands by her sides, eyes steady, not expectant, just there. Shadow didn't bolt forward. She didn't freeze either. She looked. A long, quiet look, as if weighing something invisible. Behind her was Kennel 17, the soft hum of memory, the shade, the smell of disinfectant and safety. In front of her was something else, possibility. And then, without fuss, without drama, Shadow stepped forward. One paw, then the other, across the threshold, not turning back, not racing ahead, just walking. As if every step was a deep exhale after a lifetime of holding breath. Mira didn't move. Didn't follow. She only spoke when Shadow's full silhouette had passed through the door and into the open yard. Her voice was low, gentle, but it carried. "Go ahead, girl," she said softly. "This world's been waiting for you." "Go ahead, Shadow. There are no cages out there anymore." Shadow didn't stop, but his tail gave the smallest wag. Just once. Just enough for Mira to know. He heard her, and he understood. Above him the sky was soft gray, not bright, but not heavy like it used to be. The kind of sky that didn't ask much. Just let things breathe. The grass under Shadow's paws wasn't perfect. A little rough, a little patchy, but soft enough for every step to feel less afraid. And in the middle of it all, Shadow didn't look like a ghost anymore. Not like that shaking, silent figure from the corner of Kennel 17. He stood there now, not as a shadow, but as someone real, solid, breathing, alive. That morning, the east wing of Laurel Creek opened its doors. It was a special room, built for group therapy. Sunlight poured in through wide windows. The carpet was soft, the shelves are low. Blankets were folded neatly on the side, like someone was saving a spot just in case you needed warmth. Michael brought Shadow to the doorway, then let go of the leash. Mira was right beside him. She didn't hold on, just rested a gentle hand on Shadow's back, like a whisper. "Just be here," it said. "That's enough." Shadow stepped inside, not fast, not fearful, but not too close to anyone either. He chose a quiet spot near Mira, close to the door, just in case. In the room were 8 people, 4 adults, 4 kids, every one of them carrying something you couldn't see. Grief, fear, trauma, the kind of weight that doesn't show up in X-rays, but still makes your body ache. They sat in a loose circle, scattered in little islands of silence. Shadow didn't try to fill the space. He didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't wag his tail or ask for attention. He just watched, ears up, eyes steady, like he was trying to understand this new language made of pauses and lowered eyes. In the far corner, there was a boy. Leo, maybe 10 years old, small for his age. His long black hair fell like a curtain over half his face. He didn't speak, didn't lift his head, just clutched a pillow against his chest like it was the only thing keeping him from disappearing. He hadn't looked at anyone. Not once. Mira noticed. She knelt down beside Shadow, not saying a word. Her gaze drifted to Leo, soft and patient, like a door that wasn't locked, just waiting to be opened. And then, Leo looked up. Just a flick of his head. Just long enough for his eyes to meet Shadow's. Not for long. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But in that tiny glance, something passed between them. A recognition. Like they both knew what it meant to sit in silence and still feel everything. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. People began to speak. A woman shared how she dropped a kitchen knife and froze, heart racing. A little girl whispered about how ambulance sirens made her cry. Shadow didn't move. But his ears stayed alert, his eyes calm, like he was holding every story with quiet reverence. Leo stayed silent, until Mira stood up to get more water. When she turned back, she froze. Leo was no longer in his chair. He'd gotten up, pillow still in hand. His steps were small, careful, but steady. He crossed the room and sat down beside Shadow. The boy didn't go to the adults. He didn't move toward the other kids. He just sat a little closer to Shadow. And Shadow? Shadow didn't walk over, but he didn't leave either. He turned his head and looked at Leo. Not curious, not cautious, just present. No judgment, no need for anything more. Leo settled onto the carpet, about 2 arm lengths away, still his own island, still a little unsure. He placed the pillow gently beside him, like it was okay to let go of it for now. Then slowly, he reached out his hand. Not far. Not all the way. Just halfway into the space between them, the kind of space where trust doesn't have to land on skin to be felt. Shadow tilted his head. Ears up. He didn't back away. Didn't break eye contact. Just took a deep breath, low and steady. Then, without blinking, he rested his chin on the floor, eyes fixed on that small, waiting hand. It wasn't a grand moment, but it cracked something open. A tiny point of connection. Quiet and fragile, but real. The air in the room shifted just enough for people to feel it, like a hairline crack in a heavy wall, letting in the first sliver of light. By the 3rd afternoon of group therapy, the clouds outside had thickened again. Pale gray pressed against the windows, but inside, the room was calm. Warm yellow light spilled softly across the carpet. The circle was set round cushions in every color. Kids and adults sat scattered, just close enough to know they weren't alone, but far enough not to crowd. Michael opened the session with a soft tone. Today, if you're okay with it, we'll each share something we're afraid of. You don't have to explain. No long stories. Just name the fear. Mira sat near the edge of the circle, with Shadow lying close beside her. As always, Shadow didn't push into anyone's space. Just stayed next to Mira, head resting on his paws, eyes open, ears listening in his own quiet way. The first to speak was an older woman. Her voice trembled a bit, but every word landed clearly. I'm afraid no one will find me, if I fall. Then a younger man. His jaw clenched before he spoke. I'm afraid of losing control when I hear someone scream. A small girl whispered, barely more than air. I'm scared my mom will leave again without telling me. Then came Leo's turn. He sat still, hands clasped tight in his lap, eyes fixed on the floor. No one pressured him, no one rushed. But the room waited, and Leo knew it. He breathed in just once. Then, softly, so softly Mira almost missed it, he said, I hate the sound of breaking glass. No one reacted. But something happened. People's eyes shifted, just slightly, like that one line had carved a little doorway in their own silence. It wasn't the kind of fear you could point at. It had no shape. But the way Leo said it, you knew it came from something cracked, something sharp that never fully healed. And that's when Shadow, who hadn't moved all morning, quietly got up. Mira leaned forward instinctively, like she might need to stop him. But then she paused. Her hand hovered in the air, then dropped back into her lap. Shadow didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. He walked a slow, gentle arc and stopped right in the center of the circle, surrounded by people, by stories too hard to tell, by things no one could fix. He lay down. Right there, right in the middle. And he stayed. Shadow didn't crouch low like he was afraid. He didn't tense up like he was bracing for something. He just lay down soft, slow, his chest flat to the floor, head turned slightly, eyes open. Like that spot in the middle of the room was exactly where he meant to be. The silence stretched. Not heavy, just full. Mira pressed her bottom lip between her teeth, not out of worry, but because something deep was moving inside her, all at once. Then, from the right, a breath let go. Quiet, like someone had just dropped a weight they'd been holding far too long. And after that, the softest laugh. Not loud, not jarring, just light, like a leaf brushing the surface of still water. The kind of laugh that says, maybe, just maybe, things are starting to shift. No one had asked Shadow to do any of that. No cues, no training, just instinct from a soul that had once been locked up but now knew. Sometimes just showing up is enough. Leo didn't say anything. He just kept watching Shadow. But Mira noticed. Leo's hand reached out, barely noticeable, and tugged his pillow a little closer, toward the dog. That day didn't end in applause. There weren't any tears, just a circle, still but no longer empty in the center. Later that afternoon, the rain came without warning. No thunder, no lightning, just heavy, rushing drops that hammered the roof and danced across the windows of Laurel Creek. The kind of rain that fills the space with sound, loud but steady, like a heartbeat finally breaking free. Everyone moved inside. Kids shuffled across soft mats, settling into the cozy room they now knew well. The adults stayed close but were careful not to crowd. Mira closed the last door behind her, then turned to check the room. And that's when Shadow walked in. No leash, no call. He just appeared in the doorway, shook the rain from his coat with a quiet flick, and stepped inside. No barking, no nervous glances. Shadow walked among these people, once strangers, like he had always belonged. At the far corner of the room, Leo sat with his knees hugged tight to his chest. Alone. Silent. The sound of rain grew louder, echoing through the space like faraway chaos returning home. Leo's hands rose to his head, his body tightened. Curled in, no one moved right away. See, to most people it was just a rainy day. But to Leo it was a storm that never really left. A memory with teeth. Broken glass, flashing lights, a car flipped in the dark, and the sound of it all still trapped somewhere behind his eyes. Mira noticed it instantly. She took a step forward. But she wasn't the first one to reach him. Shadow was already on his way. No hesitation, no pause, just slow, steady steps across the room. Not around anyone, not avoiding the pain, just heading straight toward it, gentle as wind brushing through tall grass, like he knew. Like he remembered, too. Shadow stopped right beside Leo. He didn't nudge him, didn't whimper, didn't lick his face like a trained therapy dog trying to comfort. Shadow just sat there, quiet, steady, still, like a presence that asked for nothing and offered everything. Leo didn't move right away. He kept his arms wrapped around his head. His breathing was still quick and uneven. But after a moment, after the thunder inside him began to settle, Leo slowly lifted his head. His eyes met Shadow's. There was no fear in that gaze, no judgment, just warmth, depth, and patience. Leo didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Instead, he leaned forward. Just a little. And rested his shoulder gently against Shadow's back. No one in the room moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the rain, tapping soft and steady against the window. And there they were, two silhouettes, one small and trembling, the other large and calm, sitting side by side like anchors in the storm. Quiet, grounded. Enough. Mira stood across the room, watching. Her fingers curled in toward her palm, holding herself still. She blinked fast, trying to stop the tears from falling. Not because she was sad, but because that moment, it was a miracle. One that didn't need to be explained. In that moment, there was no fear, no panic, Just a child who had found comfort in a creature once too broken to trust, and a dog who used to flinch at every sound, now doing something no one could have ever taught. Being a safe place for someone else. The rain kept falling, but somehow today, the wounds didn't feel open anymore. Monday morning came wrapped in pale gray skies. No rain, just that soft kind of damp that clings to everything and makes you walk a little slower. Laurel Creek was quiet, as usual. The distant bark of a dog echoed now and then, and the old wall clock near the window gave its gentle chime every 10 minutes, like it had nowhere else to be. Mira sat at the front desk, a worn adoption form laid out in front of her. The paper was slightly wrinkled at the corners, stained a soft yellow from waiting too long. Her fingers held a blue pen. The tip hovered over the first blank line. Pet's name. She paused for a second, then wrote it slowly, one careful letter at a time. Shadow. Behind her, soft footsteps approached. Michael. He didn't say anything, just stood nearby, holding a file folder in his hand. The room was still. Quiet. Like it, too, was holding its breath for what was about to come next. No one had to say it out loud. This wasn't some impulsive choice. This was the end of a quiet journey. The result of all those days, Mira sat alone in front of Kennel 17, in the sharp chill and the sterile sting of antiseptic. All those moments, Shadow inched closer, nose barely brushing her hand. All the silences. All the pauses that weren't filled with fear anymore. Two souls inching toward each other, without a map, without words, both of them cracked in places no one could see. Mira slowly turned the adoption form to its final page. There was a blank line at the bottom with a question typed neatly above it. Why did you choose this dog? She stared at it for a long while. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the truth needed to be written right. Carefully, she pressed the pen to the page. The blue ink came out soft and sure. Because we both survived, but neither of us is who we used to be. She let the pen go, breathing out gently, then folded the paper with care, like it wasn't just a form, but something sacred. A quiet promise between two beings who had seen too much. She stood, both hands holding the form like it meant more than paperwork, and walked over to Michael. He took it with both hands, looked at her. No words, just a slow, steady nod. They didn't need to say anything else. Shadow had been chosen, not because he needed a home, but because someone had seen him, not the broken parts or the bruises, but all the quiet, careful pieces that still wanted to love. And this time, he wasn't just being rescued. He was being chosen, fully, with intention, with love that had grown slow, like roots in soft soil. Before the adoption could be finalized, Mira had to meet with the center's psychologist, the same woman who had quietly monitored Shadow's recovery over the past few weeks. The consultation room was small and calm. Beige walls, a single photo of a forest turning red in autumn. The ceiling lights were soft, not direct, as if even the lighting knew how to be gentle here. Mira sat across from the doctor, hands folded in her lap, her posture straight, her gaze calm. Not eager, not anxious. Just present. The doctor opened her notepad, voice steady, tone professional. If one day Shadow has a relapse, panic, fear, regression, what would you do? Mira didn't answer right away. She exhaled slowly, her voice barely above a whisper but firm. I won't try to fix it. I'll just sit with him, like I did the day of the thunderstorm. And for a moment, the room was silent again. not heavy, just full of something soft and honest, like understanding. The doctor jotted a few notes, then looked up again, voice calm but pointed. If Shadow doesn't adjust to the new home, if life outside the center feels too different? Mira didn't hesitate. I won't force Shadow to adapt. I'll let him choose every corner of the house, and if I have to, I'll sleep next to whatever rug he picks first. The doctor nodded once, slowly, then asked one final question softer, heavier than the others. And if the memories still cling to him, if loud noises, raised hands, or broken trust come back to haunt him, what then? Mira's hands tightened slightly in her lap. Then she spoke. Not in a rush, not in order, not to prove anything. She told the truth in pieces, like memories do. She told him about the rainy night when Shadow no longer threw himself at the walls, just trembled gently and lay still, listening to her read aloud. About that morning with the wind chimes, when Shadow stood at the edge of the north yard and didn't back away. She told him about the first nose touch to her open palm, about the quiet afternoon when Leo, a boy who couldn't find words, leaned into Shadow's back without being asked. Her voice softened at the end, but every word landed clear. Shadow doesn't need to be perfect. He just needs to know he has a place to come back to now. Silence filled the room. The doctor set down his pen. No more questions, no quick conclusions. Then, after a long pause, he gave a single nod. Slow, grounded, not casual, not generous, just real. The kind of nod that says, I believe you, because you didn't just speak this, you lived it. With a quiet kind of patience no one taught you, and a tenderness that doesn't ask for attention. When Mira stepped out of the office, her eyes flicked towards the hallway window. Outside, Shadow was sitting, not pacing, not scratching at the glass, just sitting, waiting. That morning wasn't hot, wasn't cold either. The light fell just right, casting soft tree shadows across the stone path outside Laurel Creek. There were no banners, no speeches, but something sacred was happening anyway. Michael carefully hung a small wooden plaque on the gate of Kennel 17. Pale pine, sanded edges, and a name written by hand in bold black ink. Shadow adopted by Mira Callan. Mira didn't walk close. She stayed a few steps back. She didn't call his name, didn't reach out. She just stood there, giving space. A quiet kind of respect for a choice that was now his. Shadow stepped out quietly. No rush, no hesitation, no flinching at the sounds around him. His body didn't carry that tight, rigid stillness anymore. There was rhythm now in the way he walked. Steady, measured. His tail didn't wag, but it didn't tuck either. As he neared the kennel gate, Shadow slowed, then stopped. The little wooden sign swayed gently in the morning breeze. Shadow tilted his head. He looked. No one said a word. Not Michael. Not Mira. They just stood still, letting the moment be what it was. Then, as if something unseen guided him. Not a cue, not a memory, but maybe the quiet instinct of a soul beginning to heal. Shadow lowered his head and touched it. His nose pressed softly against the sign, against the name. Not the name someone once gave him out of convenience, but the name he had lived his way into. Shadow. No applause, no praise, just something in Mira's chest tightening. Not tears, not yet. But that raw, quiet ache you feel when you witness something real. Something untrainable, unscripted, something that could only come from trust. Michael exhaled softly. No longer a manager evaluating a case file, just a man, standing still, humbled by the silent confirmation of a spirit that once had nothing, not even a name to believe in. Shadow didn't look back. He didn't need to. Mira turned toward the front door, and Shadow followed. No leash, no command, no name was called, just footsteps, one soft, one strong, side by side. Together they walked. Past the center doors, down the gray-tiled hallway, across the grass still damp with morning dew, through the old iron gate that had once closed behind too many broken dreams. There was no cheer, no soundtrack, only wind, and the first light of day. Mira opened the car door without a word. Shadow looked at the back seat, then climbed in by himself. He curled up. No tension, no hesitation. Just a tired body finally letting go. Like he knew somehow. This next stretch of road wasn't an end. It was the beginning of something else. In Mira's hand was the adoption form, still folded, still warm from her grip. The name Shadow was printed in bold ink across the top, not filed away under special case anymore. Shadow had a name now, and he was the one who touched it first, as if to say, in the quietest, gentlest way, "I'm ready." That evening, the house was calm. Soft yellow light spilled from a small ceiling lamp, casting a gentle warmth across the wooden floor. Mira's home wasn't fancy, just a small cabin tucked into the edge of town with a few lavender bushes out back and one old pine tree that refused to fall no matter how hard the wind blew. In the kitchen, Mira was setting the table, a steaming plate of pasta for herself, and next to it, a clean white ceramic bowl filled with hand-shredded chicken and no seasoning. Just care. That bowl was for Shadow. Shadow sat near the door, not timid, not charging forward, just watching. His eyes met Mira's, not begging, not uncertain, just asking in his way. "Am I allowed to be here?" Mira didn't rush to speak. She placed her own plate down, then sat beside his bowl, lowering herself to his level. "This is yours, Shadow," she said softly, her hand resting near the edge of the bowl, but not pushing it forward. Shadow stepped toward it. Not quickly, each step measured, like he was still learning to trust the floor beneath him. Then he lowered his head. No frantic chewing, no messy gulping, just one quiet sniff. And then, gently, Shadow began to eat. Slowly, as if tasting not just the food, but the trust it came with. Mira didn't eat. She just watched. A dog eating dinner shouldn't feel like a ceremony, but that night it was. It meant something. It meant this room, this floor, this quiet was home now. When Shadow finished, Mira stood up. She walked to a low drawer and pulled out a soft gray mat with cotton trim. She laid it down in the coziest corner of the kitchen, right where the light hit like a blanket. Right beside the ceramic bowl. Then she sat down on the floor, pressed her hand gently to the edge of the mat, and whispered, "This spot is yours now, Shadow. From now on." Shadow didn't answer. Of course he didn't. But he didn't wander either. He turned, circled once, then settled on the mat, tucked his nose into his front legs, and let out one slow breath, the kind that sounds like a sigh when the weight finally lifts. Mira stayed for a few minutes. She didn't pet him, didn't say more. She just sat beside him and let the quiet do what it does best, make room for a life to begin again. Outside the window, the rain had started again. Software steady, a hush of water tapping on the old tile roof. But inside, The kitchen stayed warm. And the dog, who once couldn't bring himself to cross a wooden doorway, was now sleeping soundly on a mat that was his. The first night in a new home. A breeze moved gently through the screen by the back porch, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the fading sweetness of late-season grass. The kitchen lights were off now. Only the faint amber glow from the living room cast a soft shine across the polished wooden floor. Mira hadn't bought a fancy dog bed. Just an old blanket, clean, soft, and carrying her scent, which she spread quietly in a calm corner near the back door. Not too bright, not too hidden. Just enough to see the night sky. Just enough to hear the leaves rustle without getting scared. Shadow moved slowly through the house. Not sneaking, not rushing, just pacing the rooms like he was listening to them, as if every space had its own breath, and he was learning how to breathe with it. From the doorway of her bedroom, Mira stood watching. She didn't say a word, didn't signal. She simply left her bedroom door slightly ajar. Not an invitation, not a command, just a silent offering. If Shadow wanted a spot beside her, it would always be there. The night deepened. The wind nudged the curtains. The house went still. Around midnight, soft footsteps sounded against the floorboards. Mira didn't open her eyes. She didn't need to. She knew the rhythm, slow, even, thoughtful. Not lost, not frightened. Just seeking a quiet place. The breath paused at the threshold. She could feel it. Shadow was sitting there, just a few steps away. Not coming in. Not walking away either. Just present. And sometimes, presence is everything. The next morning, sunlight reached gently through the back door. Mira walked into the kitchen. The blanket lay exactly where she left it. Flat. Unbothered. Except right at the center, a single curve of fur, black and silver, pressed lightly into the fabric. A soft arc, like the shape of something once curled up there. Still. No words needed, no proof asked, just one small trace. Enough to say, Shadow had stayed. Not because he had to, not because someone told him to, but because he chose to. Later that morning, Mira took Shadow to the small park at the end of the street. The path circled through a patch of green. No cars, just a couple of joggers and an elderly couple sitting on a bench, sharing the kind of silence only years can build. Mira brought a leash, but she didn't use it. She folded it neatly into her coat pocket, just in case. Not out of blind trust, but because she wanted to see, to know if what they'd built together over these past weeks was strong enough to be called faith. Shadow didn't wander. He didn't bolt forward. He didn't cling to Mira's side either. He just walked beside her. Close, but not too close. Step by step, like two quiet friends moving through the world, not needing to hold hands, but still facing the same way. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting soft patches of gold across the brick path. You could hear the birds and the quiet crunch of a bicycle somewhere in the distance. The kind of sounds that make you feel like the world is just okay for a moment. Up ahead, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, was learning to ride her bike, wobbly, determined, and then she tumbled, right into the grass at the edge of the road. No screaming, no dramatic sobs, just fast breathing, wide eyes, and the kind of stunned silence kids get when the world surprises them. Mira instinctively took a step forward, but Shadow had already stopped. He didn't bark, didn't rush. He just looked. Then, like something old and quiet inside him had stirred, Shadow began to move. One step, then another. Slow, gentle, not a sound. He stopped a meter away. The girl looked up. She saw the big dog standing there, tall and still. Her eyes shimmered, still holding the hint of tears. But she didn't cry. She just stared back. And then nodded. A small, quiet nod, like she recognized something about him. Something that didn't need words. Mira didn't interrupt. She stayed back, watching, and whispered more to herself than anyone else. Shadow doesn't need to be trained to be a therapy dog. He just remembers what it's like to hurt, and that's why he knows how not to scare anyone. After a moment, the girl's mother came jogging over and gently helped her up. Shadow turned, calmly walked back toward Mira. His tail didn't wag in excitement. It moved like a whisper through the air, soft, unfussed. Like the whole thing had happened not for praise or reward, but simply because it felt right. They took one more lap around the park. Then they went home. The sun was higher now, warm light spilling across the front porch, brushing over the old brick steps like a quiet blessing. And there, right in that golden strip of light, Shadow laid down. Stretched out, long, eyes half closed, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. No more alert, guarded gaze. No more tension in his muscles. Just peace. The kind that only comes after you've walked through the dark. And finally found a place where you don't have to look over your shoulder anymore. Sometimes, the worst wounds aren't the ones left by betrayal. They're the ones left by silence, by being doubted, by being accused without proof. Just like Duke, some of us have lived in cages we didn't build, locked in by someone else's choices, mistrust, lies, or a story about us that we never got to write. And when that happens, when you're blamed without evidence, or suspected without cause, it can feel like the whole world has turned its back. So what do? You don't fight fire with fire. You don't beg to be believed. Instead, you stay calm. You document what matters. You protect your name not out of pride, but out of truth. And if there are children involved, you protect their peace before proving your point. If your heart is breaking, know this: you are not alone. And healing doesn't always begin with justice. It begins with being seen. Like Duke, maybe what we all need is someone who won't walk away. Someone who doesn't rush to fix but chooses to stay. Have you ever been in Duke's place? Judged too quickly? Suspected unfairly? Or maybe you've felt the ache of loving someone who stopped trusting you. We want to hear your story. Share it in the comments. Because in this space, we believe in second chances. And sometimes, the strongest healing begins when someone simply stays. So tell us, what did you survive, and what helped you come back?